Hey everyone, this is chapter 3 of. Ready for me to butcher the name again? Svetozar Stojanović. The book, I didn't say the book title. Between Ideals and Reality, a critique of socialism and its future. Okay, and chapter 3 is titled The Statist Myth of Socialism. Are you ready to rock? I sure am. Section 1. Our century abounds in ideological political myths. The most prominent of them, the myth above myths of our age, is the statist myth of socialism. With the degeneration of the October Revolution, a new exploitative class system was created, a system which stubbornly tries to pass itself off as socialism. Unfortunately, almost everyone believes in the socialist identity of Stalinist society. The ideologues of, quote, socialist statism announced long ago that their society had completed the construction of socialism and had begun the construction of communism. They operate on the assumption that the construction of communism can be based upon an omnipotent state. Thus, in addition to the statist myth of socialism, there is also the statist myth of communism. Marxists may argue over adequate interpretations of Marx's conception of the socialist state, but statist communism, even at first glance, is completely absurd to anyone who knows anything about the authentic Marx. In this chapter, I shall suggest an outline for a theory of statism as a new form of class society. There have generally been few ideas in contemporary social science which have not had their roots in the past. The idea of a new form of class society after capitalism originated with Jan Vaclav Mahayski. In The Evolution of Social Democracy, Mahayski claimed that after the socialist revolution, the intelligentsia would become the new ruling class. In a letter written in 1930, Christian Rakovsky contended that a new ruling class was already being created in the USSR. Anton Siliga expressed a similar opinion in his In the Land of the Big Lie, or Au Pays du Grand Mensonge, published in Paris in 1937. Toward the end of the 1930s, there was a long discussion in the press of the Fourth International on the nature of the Stalinist system. Some discussants put forth the view that this is a new form of class society. In 1939, in his La bureaucratisation du monde, the bureaucratization of the world, Bruno Rizzi called this society, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote. And it should be noted that Bruno Rizzi was kind of just like on the outside of on the outside, very much on the outskirts of like certain left groups. And the bureaucratization of the world, I have a piece on here by Bruno Rizzi called The Jewish Question, and a bunch of little biography. I have a bunch of shit by Rizzi about Rizzi on this channel, but he had the opinion that capitalism was akin to the Jewish conspiracy, and basically that bureaucratic collectivism was, despite its totalitarianism, was a progressive step forward for humanity, and that socialists should throw in their lot with, and workers should throw in their lot with bureaucratic collectivism. And he thought that bureaucratic collectivism was like the wave of the future, and that it was not only being spearheaded by the Soviet Union, but also by Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. He was also, what's the word? He thought that socialists should support those states as well, against the Allies. Very much a crank. Very much an anti-Semite. It's hard to even categorize. It would be difficult to categorize him as even like a leftist. Another tradition, the theory of managerial society, was formulated by James Burnham in the Managerial Revolution. The concept which I advocate here shares nothing substantive with the idea of managerial revolution and managerial society. Burnham generally does not use the categories of statism and the statist class. The difference here is not only terminological. Burnham's managerial class is not the same as the statist class, which I suggest. The statist class is composed of the entire state apparatus having transformed itself from the representative of the working class into the collective owner of the means of production. Burnham's managerial class is composed of state economic functionaries. Burnham explicitly excludes state political functionaries from its membership and therefore rejects, also explicitly, theories of bureaucratic society, including Rizzi's theory of bureaucratic collectivism. That would not stop people, Trotskyists and Rizzi himself, from claiming that Burnham's theory was just a ripoff of Rizzi's. But there's pretty substantial. It's like a lot of the ideas that were expressed by all these people were very much, so-called, quote, in the air. The idea that the world was heading towards statism and away from the free market was a very common opinion, and kind of was taken for granted by a lot of leftists in general, who definitely viewed like concentration and monopoly and the increasing monopolization of production by a few corporations and the cooperation between those corporations and the state being like the wave of the future, or just like what was happening. So like neither of their theses were like super shattering. Anyway, 2, for Burnham, the October Revolution was a managerial revolution, while for me it was a socialist revolution par excellence, although a new form of class, statist society, was born with Stalinism. Burnham considered the establishment of managerial society not only a real process, but also a necessary process. Burnham went so far as to assert that in the 1960s the managerial transformation of the world would near completion. For me, again, the degeneration of the socialist revolution is not at all inevitable. 2 possibilities are being laid bare as a consequence of the crisis of capitalism, statism, and socialism. This is now the principal dilemma of our epoch. 3. Burnham asserted that the USSR, Germany, and Italy most closely approximated the model of managerial society, while the process of managerization was perceptible in other countries as well, including the United States. Burnham held the principal managerial ideologies to be Leninism, Stalinism, fascism, Nazism, and the ideology of the New Deal. Of course, it would not occur to me to lump all of these countries and ideologies together. For me, Leninism is a socialist revolutionary ideology, while for Burnham, Leninism is an ideology of the managerial revolution. 4. On the basis of his theory, Burnham made several other mistaken judgments and predictions: that World War II was the first great managerial struggle, that it would yield the formation of 3 managerial superpowers, the core of which would be composed of Germany, Japan, and the United States, that the USSR would decompose into 2 parts, Western and Eastern, and that the former would be part of the superpower centered upon Germany, while the latter would be part of the superpower centered upon Japan, and that there would be no other independent countries. It is well known that after 1948, a critical examination and interpretation of Stalinism began to develop in Yugoslavia. The limitations of this process of reinterpretation have, among other things, influenced me to propose an outline of a theory of statist society. In one view, Stalinism is a form of state capitalism. This was the officially accepted view in Yugoslavia during the struggle with the common form. Footnote: a group of Marxists in the West as well, including Erich Fromm and Herbert Marcuse, recognize that the Stalinist system is exploitative and justly do not want to call it socialist. But since Marxist theory in its inertia only has places for either capitalism or socialism in its portrayal of contemporary society, they find the solution in the notion of state capitalism. And footnote. And that's like a common critique of state capitalism, right? The state capitalist theories is that the conceptual tools that they use to analyze Stalinist type societies are like anachronistic, right? They're kind of like drawing on familiar categories and to explain an unprecedented phenomenon. Anyway, but the difference between state capitalism and the Stalinist system is rather obvious. As in the Stalinist system, there are no capitalists, nor does capital exist as a social relation. In another view, one which currently reigns in Yugoslavia and to which we shall return later, Stalinism is bureaucratic socialist society. While I am rather indebted to this tradition, I must say that it was precisely its difficulties which above all prompted me to follow the argument to its logical conclusion, to my position on statist society. Section 2. Marx expected the socialist revolution to occur in the wealthiest capitalist countries, but Lenin rejected this assumption in both the theoretical and practical political senses. Indeed, historical practice has proved Lenin right insofar as socialist revolutions have actually taken place in the undeveloped rather than the developed countries. There's nowhere in Marx that says, that a party of some kind, whatever ideology it may have, can come to power and try to implement policies. Marx thought that socialism needed a certain degree of material development in order to be viable, for the expropriation that occurs to be the expropriation of the expropriators. If you think of the Soviet Union, for instance, especially in the Stalin period, and leading up to that, agriculture in the country was definitely not capitalist in scope, and that's evidenced by if the peasants didn't like the prices they were getting, they could just stop producing for the market, and that created a lot of economic problems, which would not be something that would be viable if agriculture had already been commodified as thoroughly as it had been in a place like, especially for instance, like Great Britain or even the United States for that matter. Also, the expropriations that took place in collectivization, the expropriation of the peasantry in collectivization was not the expropriation of by the immense majority of property concentrated in the hands of a few, as in the sense of the expropriation of the expropriators. The Soviet state was the expropriator of small present proprietorships. That's one of the reasons why, like, socialist development needs a material backing. There's no there's no idea in Marx that says, a party that has, socialistic values or socialistic ambitions can't come to power in a society, right? You could say that, say the Jacobins, for instance, they came to power, right? They could have any ideas they want to. I mean, if they correspond to the moods, and the moods that the Jacobins corresponded to were similar moods to what the Bolsheviks, their policies and politics corresponded to. So there's nothing in Marx that says, this is just a very frustrating thing for me personally. This idea that Marx thought that, the type of coup that happened in the Soviet Union, however popularly supported it was, couldn't happen, right? That's not in Marx. If anything, the history of 20th century quote communist revolutions vindicated Marx heavily in this manner. That was kind of their constant struggle, was with backwardness, and thus, for that reason, because they were coming to power in backward societies, especially I'm not as much of an expert on China and places like that, but I know at least in the Bolshevik context, their main priority was not any kind of the humanistic democratic goals of that are found in Marx and in the socialist tradition in general, but rather the intensification of production. There's a great video by Stephen A. Smith where it talks about Bolshevism in the revolutionary period in 1917, 1918. And he's talking about how, for instance, in State and Revolution, there's kind of this very utopian, libertarian kind of spirit in Lenin, which is should be noted was an exception. to the broader thrust of his writing, which was documented by Luxemburg, by Trotsky back in the early 1900s, and and stated by others afterwards, including Rosa Luxemburg, although she died in 1919. Anarchists were still supporting the Bolshevik Revolution in 1919, so that doesn't, people try to say, well, she didn't really, her words were very damning, very, very early, way before the true extent of bureaucratism and authoritarianism would make itself felt in the Soviet, which it wasn't even the Soviet Union yet in 1919 when she died, January 1919. But anyway, back to what I was saying was like Stephen A. Smith. He talks about how like there is like kind of like this streak of utopianism that takes over certain parts of the Bolshevik Party and is manifest in writings like State and Revolution. But fundamentally, what the Bolsheviks' main vision was for Russia, in particular, was industrial development. And if that meant one-man management, if that meant Taylorism, then so be it. And this is kind of like just in Lenin's like basic thing. Like they kind of like celebrate the instead of viewing production as capitalist production as a tool of at work, like in the process of production, as a process of alienation, exploitation, domination, and hierarchy. It's fundamentally celebrated as like a disciplining force that curbs the the willfulness, or like the curbs the individualism or whatever that's ostensibly so prevalent among the bourgeois and exploiting classes. There's a so yeah, sorry, I got off track there, but I got rambling. The absence of a large developed industrial proletariat. On the other hand, those who found in Marx's assumption a more hidden, indirect sense of foreboding and caution were not far from the truth either. See, I'm right. The absence of a large, developed industrial proletariat was one of the decisive causes of the statist perversion of the socialist revolution. Moreover, the small proletariat which did exist was decimated in the revolutionary struggle. I'm pretty sure that the working class in Russia constituted, I can't remember the exact statistics, but 20%, only 20% of the population as a whole were not peasants, and only a small portion of that non-peasant population were industrial proletarians. Even though there was obviously very sophisticated factories in places such as St. Petersburg. The absence of a large, undeveloped industrial proletariat was one of the decisive causes of the statist perversion of the socialist revolution. Moreover, the small proletariat which did exist was decimated in the revolutionary struggle. We shall cite in some of the other extremely unfavorable factors in this respect: the feudal capitalistic economy and social legacy of Russia, the atmosphere bred by a tradition of political absolutism and a low standard of education and culture, the war, the obstinate counter-revolution and foreign intervention which devastated the land, the absence of effective support from the workers' movements of the developed countries, and the prolonged hostile encirclement. In such conditions, the tendency towards statism was all the stronger and its victory all the more certain. Nevertheless, it can be said that the struggle for socialism was doomed in advance to failure. There is no, quote, iron law, end quote, of revolutionary degeneration. Footnote. Robert Michel's, I don't know how to pronounce this guy's name properly, explicitly applied his, quote, iron law of oligarchy, end quote, to the socialist movement. Quote, the socialists may conquer, but not socialism, which would perish in the moment of its adherents' triumph, end quote. Robert Michel's Political Parties, a Sociological Study of the Oligarchic Tendencies of Modern Democracy. End footnote. The triumph of the statist tendency, which as a rule has a great deal of vigor and endurance, can be prevented by persistent struggle on the part of the revolutionary forces. But let us go half a century into the past. In Russia, the Revolutionary Party had to take it largely upon the Revolutionary Party's self to accomplish the mission of a yet undeveloped industrial proletariat. After the seizure and consolidation of power, the Revolutionary Party found itself confronted with a choice: either to develop the social self-government of the Soviets of workers, soldiers, and peasants' deputies, or to base the entire system permanently and exclusively upon the state party apparatus. It must be kept in mind that the idea of socialist self-government based upon worker self-management was theoretically sketched out in Marx's analysis of the Paris Commune and in Lenin's State and Revolution. Again, Lenin's State and Revolution being an exceptional text. Exactly how a socialist economy was going to look in practice was left quite vague, and to a certain extent this difficulty as well contributed to the victory of the statist tendency. There is still research on this process which remains to be done. Perhaps we ought to turn our attention all the way back to the first confrontations within the Bolshevik Party after the Bolshevik Party had come to power. One of the turning points was apparently the conflict with the so-called, quote, workers' opposition. 50 years after the October Revolution, Marxists have yet to examine and evaluate Lenin's role in this conflict in all its dimensions with a sufficient degree of impartiality. Lenin was obviously torn between the ideas of self-management he expressed in State and Revolution, and for the sake of which he had so fiercely attacked growing bureaucratism and had demanded workers' control, and the unquestionable need for the state to introduce order by means of force to organize social life out of the chaos born of counter-revolution, poverty, and famine. I don't know if I'll say this, but Lenin definitely characterized the workers' opposition as anarcho-syndicalist deviationists. I have pieces by the parts of the workers' opposition and about the workers' opposition on this channel if you are interested. I don't think that Lenin was particularly sympathetic to the workers' opposition. I don't think it really broke his heart too much to repress it and to put a ban on factions in general, which is generally targeted at the left of the party, including the workers' opposition and the democratic centralists. After Lenin's death, the emphasis shifted increasingly, both in theory and in practice, from society to the state. State socialism gradually developed into statism. I should do more research on it myself, but in the trade union debate of this early period, Lenin kind of occupied a central position, whereas people like Trotsky, the sensible grand Democrat of the Bolshevik Party, thought that the trade and emphasized the need for trade unions and lively Soviets and all this kind of stuff. Later, when he was put out of power, and they could be an impetus to bring him back into power. It's a little bit more of a cynical way of putting it, but there's a degree of truth to it. Is that he basically thought that the trade unions should just kind of be completely more or less liquidated into the state apparatus. After all, why did the workers need to defend their interest from their state? Lenin viewed that the trade unions should kind of be like educational institutions and also workers' means of advocating workers' interest in the state. And then the workers' opposition, of course, they thought that the trade unions were an ideal vehicle for which to plan the construction of socialism. Although it had originated as a distinctly anti-statist theory, Marxism has been perverted into the ideological basis of statism. The period of statist modification and adaptation of Marxism culminated in the 18th Congress of the CPSU Bolshevik Party, in which Stalin openly prescribed the position that the state would grow stronger in socialism. Some parallels can be drawn between the fates of bourgeois democratic and socialist revolutions. Both were born of hope and the definitive realization of equality. In the case of the former, the bourgeoisie gradually emerged from the ranks of the broad people's masses, the third estate. A parallel differentiation of society unfolded after the October Revolution. Expropriated feudal and bourgeois property gradually was transformed into the foundation of statist ownership, while the working class and the laboring masses became the object of a new form of exploitation. Section 3. Many severe critics of Stalinism, including the majority of Yugoslav Marxists, are prisoners of the, quote, socialist ideology of statism. Instead of recognizing Stalinism as a new form of class society, they claim that it is state socialism, albeit bureaucratized. I really hate that term, state socialism. Upon seizing power, the revolutionary movement nationalizes the means of production and the management both of production and of all social life. To be sure, this state socialism, a stage through which all socialist revolutions have passed or are still passing, is a very elementary form of socialism. One can speak of mature socialism only insofar as state property is transcended by social property and state management by social self-government. For Marx, mature socialism is a society composed of associations of free producers who consciously work according to a common and rational plan. In it, the working class develops its own powers of self-management and simultaneously stimulates the development of universal and integral social self-government. So long as the new state apparatus represents the interests of the working class and the laboring masses as a whole, Marxists can consider the system built upon these foundations to be socialist, more specifically state socialist. However, it is well known that the state apparatus, from the state apparatus's very inception, has a secondary tendency as well to emancipate the state apparatus's self from society, to become society's master, and to give the pursuit of the state apparatus's own interest priority over all others. I think that's kind of like one of the things that Marx talks about, for instance, in the contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, is that the state, far from being like in Hegel, it's kind of characterized like it has like a kind of a universalist character, of which like all of society's heterogeneous components are kind of mediated in like a universal like law or something like that. I'm not a law expert or anything like that, and I'm not an expert on this piece. I don't even know if I've read it. I think I read it a long time ago. But I know in that piece, basically what Marx said is that like the state is not this universalist instance. The state is a particularist interest par excellence, separated an alienation of the society's powers, and which subordinates society in a way similar to God would in a religious context. And that's why I think there's sometimes some kind of critique that, like, some statement in Marx, I'm not sure, maybe I'm making it up, but like all critique begins with the critique of religion. So all critique begins with the critique of heteronomy, not just socially, but in terms of like the mind. When this indeed does happen, in my opinion, it is no longer possible to speak of state socialism, but only of statism. Of course, this does not mean that in statism there are not certain elements of socialism. These may even be important elements of socialism, but only the dominant characteristics of the system as a whole are at issue here. It is theoretically insupportable to include those two essentially different systems under the heading of a single concept, that of socialism. After all, even those theorists who do so implicitly acknowledge unresolvable difficulties, for they find it necessary to draw a distinction between revolutionary and bureaucratized state socialism. But can both one and the other really remain defined as socialism without sacrificing theoretical coherence? What is there that revolutionary state socialism and this bureaucratized system have so essentially in common that we might be able to classify the latter as state socialism as well? The characteristic ascribed to this bureaucratic society by the theorists whom we are presently criticizing are diametrically opposed to those which they themselves include in their definition of revolutionary state socialism. We can say that two entities are of the same type when their properties are not only different but mutually opposed. Can we say that two entities are of the same type when these two entities' properties are not only different but mutually opposed? The theorists under discussion nevertheless assert that these systems do have one important feature in common: state ownership of the means of production of the products of labor. But this phrase covers two completely different notions which are not made explicit. When we speak of state ownership in socialism, in terms of original Marxism, we mean that the state represents and ensures the interests of the working class and the laboring masses. It is this idea which the theorists whom we have been discussing here include, with good reason, in their definition of revolutionary state socialism. Thus, state ownership simultaneously represents an initial and indirect form of social ownership. But this can hardly be said of the Stalinist system, in which the bureaucratic state is the master of society, disposing of ownership sovereignly and in its own interest. Such state ownership is collective ownership on the part of the state apparatus. Such state ownership is collective ownership on the part of the state apparatus. The theory under criticism here would dispute this assertion, but at the same time would have to admit that state ownership in a bureaucratic system is not even indirectly social ownership. It would turn out that the means of production and the products of labor are neither the property of any social group, nor of the state apparatus, nor indirectly the property of society. But whose property are they then? No one's. History has in fact obliged Marxists to introduce into their earlier differentiation of socialism and communism a division within socialism itself, between state and self-governing socialism. Consequently, the picture of the so-called transitional period has been further complicated. Not only is socialism the transitional period between capitalism and communism, but state socialism may be the transitional phase leading to self-governing socialism. But it does not have to be, as it can also degenerate into a new form of class society, statism. If the revolutionary movement is not aware that state socialism is only an elementary form of socialism, then the most probable outcome will be statism. The view that pure state socialism, where all social life is centered exclusively upon the ruling party and the state, and where not even elementary worker self-management is an objective possibility, is inevitable, has gained great currency. But I think that we might speak more accurately about choice of such a path. And the choice does not necessarily depend exclusively upon objective conditions. The claim that pure state socialism is objectively necessary is most often a rationalization for the weaknesses of the ruling party. The party comes to power holding certain conceptions about the new society. These conceptions as well play a great role here. The weakness of Marxist theory in this respect is apparent. The most there is to rely upon in the classics of Marxism is a mere sketch of socialism, which itself was from the very first the subject of interpretive debate. Thus, in the absence of a clear conception of the new society, the Communist Party has always come to power with the idea that state socialism is the paradigm of socialism. Nor has the history of the Yugoslav Revolution offered adequate proof that the period of pure state socialism prior to the introduction of workers' self-management in Yugoslavia was inevitable. What is there to be said against the opposite thesis, that it was possible to begin true socialization concurrently with nationalization? We can speak of, quote, inevitability here only if we include among the decisive factors the conception of the new society with which the Communist Party of Yugoslavia came to power. But this is something completely different from what the theorists whom we have been criticizing have in mind. Even if the party did have other ideas, they say, it would not have been able to realize them because of objective conditions. But surely conditions were more difficult between 1945 and 1948 than during the period of the most severe Stalinist offensive against Yugoslavia, when the first workers' councils were created. The struggle with the common form compelled the party to reconsider and alter its conception of internal development. By that time, the state socialist system had already begun to show symptoms of statist degeneration. Marx's categorization of socioeconomic systems long ago lost its ability to cover certain new cases, and not only those under discussion here. There are many more countries, especially those that have been recently decolonized, whose systems are also based upon state ownership and central state planning, but which few Marxists would be prepared to call socialist. Why, indeed, should such societies be called socialist only because their ruling circles do so? In such instances, certain theorists seek their, quote, salvation in the designation, quote, non-capitalist countries, end quote, exclamation point. Would it not be more acceptable to broaden Marx's categorization by introducing the category of statism? Of course, this type of statism is quite different from the statism which arose as a consequence of the degeneration of the October Revolution. Many theorists, especially Marxists, are quite happy to use this category, but only in a milder sense than the one I have suggested. They use the term to apply to the strengthening of the state in contemporary society, whether capitalist or socialist. Thus, they are theoretically powerless when the statist tendency takes such full control as to necessitate speaking about a changed, essentially new system. Even classical Marxism recognized the ever-present possibility that the state apparatus might emancipate the state apparatus itself from social classes. Marx warned of the danger that the revolutionary state might become alienated from the proletariat and finally turn against it. It is precisely this, in the opinion of many Marxists, which constitutes the principal danger confronting the socialist revolution, yet historical events have even surpassed Marx's forebodings. Thus, we must follow our line of argument to its conclusion and create a category to cover the transformation of the state apparatus into a ruling class, and accordingly for a new type of class system. It need not puzzle us in the least that it was usually only a part of the ruling class which directly participated in the governing of society in the past, and that in contrast the ruling class and the state apparatus and statist society are identical. So that's basically the bureaucratic collectivist thesis. I think Marcel van der Linden puts Stojanović in that category of bureaucratic collectivism. In the case of the statism which developed in the wake of the degeneration of the socialist revolution, the state apparatus completely coalesced with those of the Communist Party and the other political organizations constituting its transmission mechanisms. As the collective owner of the means of production, this apparatus employs the labor force and exploits it. The personal share of each representative of the ruling class in the distribution of surplus value is proportional to his position in the state hierarchy. With respect to the statist class as well, we must speak in the true Marxist spirit of the prospects for expropriating the expropriators and for socializing the means of production. Section 4. The Stalinist system possesses all the essential properties of statism. Stalinists equate the state with society in every respect, even with reference to ownership of the means of production and management of production. Some critics of Stalinism are not able to see through the socialist mystification of statist property because these critics adhere to the practice of connecting the concept of ruling class ownership with private ownership of the means of production. And that's precisely Trotsky's point. There's a footnote here. Let's see if he says that. See, for instance, the previously mentioned article by Miroslav Pes-Ulich. Quote, only the fusion of two great systems, private control over the conditions of labor and family inheritance, creates class structure, end quote. And this is precisely Trotsky's point too. Some people, especially in the bureaucratic collectivist tradition, in order to I think promote themselves as the the authentic inheritors of the Trotskyist tradition, say that Trotsky was just on the brink of saying that the bureaucracy was a new class society, but I don't think that's the case. Trotsky very much had the idea that the only counter-revolution that was substantially on the table in the Stalinist period was a capitalist counter-revolution. Stalinism itself was not a counter-revolution. For Trotsky, the bureaucracy was not a class, for one, because he had this naive notion that the bureaucracy wouldn't be able to pass its privileges on to their children, and that their privileges were really highly unstable, which I think proved itself to be a very, very dubious position. If they were unstable, it was because their lives were unstable, because they were subordinated to Stalin. The bureaucracy itself was subordinated to Stalin, as Trotsky rightly points out. But Trotsky had this idea that Trotsky's idea was essentially that the bureaucracy could only be a ruling class if it privatized property. That was the only way it could really become a class. He viewed he kind of just had this idea that was kind of translating the making false analogies between a society, like a capitalist society in which the economy is private, vis-a-vis the state. So there's this kind of stark separation between not stark, but it's an interconnected, but very distinct separation between the economy and the state, and kind of applying that to a society in which the economy had been completely statized. Basically thinking that you could have this really brutal totalitarian political apparatus, which is politically worse than fascism, only worse than fascism in its, quote, unbridled savagery, unquote. from Trotsky, and that's a quote from Trotsky in the I can't remember the call, but the Declaration of the Fourth International, the death agony of capitalism. But he had the idea that like the only way that a bureaucracy is not a class. And he says contradictory things all over the place in his writings about how like the bureaucracy has no independent role in production, but at the same time in other places he says that basically it has like a managerial function, but it's not enough to be the manager of a trust. One has to own stocks and bonds essentially in a trust for their managerial position and their privileges to constitute class privileges and class exploitation. So Trotsky basically characterized over and over again that the bureaucracy's disproportionate income was due to basically theft from the state, sort of kind of like systematic embezzlement, like a parasitism on the state apparatus, on the workers' state. But it did not constitute a class. Because it did not actually own property. It just enjoyed unequal income. So in a certain sense, it was basically like the bureaucracy was like kind of like a class, like almost like a group of like CEOs, right? Who, you know, depending on how you want to argue it, don't constitute part of like the bourgeois class insofar as they're paid wages of superintendents as opposed to, even though they often own like massive shares of companies and stuff like that. But they're basically like the bureaucracy just receives like inflated wages of attendance or something like that. So like it didn't actually have like, it actually wasn't a class. It wasn't a class at all in Trotsky's view. Some people try to say Trotsky was just on the cusp of saying that, based upon some things that he says in an article titled "The USSR in War." But I think his people say like, oh, in that article right there, it was just about to come to the conclusion that the USSR was a bureaucratic class society. I don't agree with that view. I think there was mounting contradictions in his own theory that he was struggling to account for. That's definitely clear. But I don't think that he might have changed it eventually, but we don't know that. He was assassinated. Anyway, sorry, I'm chatty. Anyway, end footnote. He didn't mention Trotsky. But according to this logic, the church hierarchy was not part of the feudal ruling class, since the church hierarchy's members did not privately own the means of production, nor did their children inherit any property. And that's one of the, actually, it's funny that he says that, because that's one of the main arguments, especially from Tony Cliff, who obviously was a Trotskyist, but adopted a state capitalist understanding of the USSR. He basically said the same thing. It's like, there's many instances in history where the ruling class did not own the means of production as parcelized private property. Anyway, moving on. Sorry about that. In statist society, as has been already stated, the ruling class is the collective owner of the means of production. The share of surplus value appropriated by statist society's members is defined by their position in the state hierarchy. This is a very tricky thing, right? Because he's saying that using the word surplus value, which is very historically specific, which is specific to capitalism, right? And it's specific to markets as well. Surplus value must be redeemed, right? If you have a batch of commodities in a production process, money commodity, money prime, those commodities are only ideally impregnated with value, and who in order to prove that they actually have value, they must be sold, right? And if they're not sold, the whole fucking system collapses, right? Or the whole business collapses. That particular business collapses at the very least. So the exchange, the redemption of value, the redeeming of value on the market via sale is a necessary component of capitalism, capitalist production. So it seems like he's saying, if you're using the word surplus value, there's a premise in there that there is still a market operative in the Soviet Union. and in these statist societies. So, state capitalists always say, okay, well, if there's surplus value, which they think there is, with better and worse arguments for that, then it is a capitalist society. It's not just a non-state exploitative society. It's a capitalist exploitative society on the basis of state ownership. There's some shitty arguments for that, right? Like Tony Cliff, for instance, talks about surplus value all the time, but he basically says the surplus that's being produced in the Soviet Union fundamentally takes the form of use value, especially in like military form, which does not necessitate sales. Surplus value, and this is something that I'll argue to the death, is that surplus value is fundamentally dependent on sales, unless like surplus as such does not necessarily entail a value form. If we lose that, we abandon totally the specifics of capitalist society, and if we do that, we might as well throw the critique of political economy in the fucking garbage. In my opinion. Man, I feel like I'm on crack right now. Actually, the nature and degree of their participation in all decisions about production and the distribution of surplus value is defined in this manner. One peculiarity of the statist class is that the statist class's economic power derives from the statist class's political power, while the opposite is true of the bourgeoisie. And that's precisely what the bureaucratic collectivists will say, the bureaucratic collectivist critique of Trotsky, right? Is that, and this is one of the things with Trotsky. This is not about Trotsky. It's about he's not talking about Trotsky, but now Trotsky on the brain is that Trotsky kind of fundamentally thinks that you can make a sharp political distinction between the economic content of the Soviet Union and its political content, right? You can have this totalitarian bureaucratic class that fucking just like takes large swaths of the direct producers and puts them in jail, and it can still be a worker state. When the separation, I think that there's work by Ellen Mason's Wood that I think is fantastic. I don't know if I've actually read the article proper, but it's kind of like a premise that she talks about in a lot of her works, is that the base superstructure metaphor, the idea of like the separation of the economic from the political is something that's very much characteristic of capitalist society as such. In other forms of society where that aren't capitalist, you don't have that kind of like bifurcation, right? And also so like with Trotsky though, he thinks that like basically you can have like, especially in a planned society, in a planned economy based on state property, like you can't really say that there's this kind of like, that the working class has social power, which Trotsky doesn't emphasize as much in his later work, but it's still a premise in his thing. Maybe he does mention it later in his work. Not important right now. What I'm trying to say is that he basically thinks that like you can still have a worker state where the workers are completely deprived of any political power. And that's fundamentally what the bureaucratic collectivists will say, which I think is Stojanović is kind of like in that tradition, is that no, in a society where the economy's been nationalized and the economy is planned, however poorly, economic power and political power very much fuse. Whereas in capitalists, say in the Nazi period, right, we have this extreme autonomization of the state, the extreme like concentration of power in the state, which can make decisions. Insofar as it doesn't nationalize property, you can be a very successful businessman with no political power in the Third Reich, for instance. You might have to have political connections or whatever, but your power fundamentally does not come through your connection to an office of some kind. Whereas in the Soviet Union, that was, or in places where the economy has been nationalized, that's no longer the case. The power of the working class fundamentally has, actually has to have real control of the state apparatus and not just some kind of like ideal paper that, it's the property of the people anyway. Anyway, we must admit that Marxist theory has not left enough latitude for this type of political determinism. Since members of the ruling class as individuals cannot dispose of the means of production, many people suppose that the means of production are not the property of the state apparatus. The observation that nepotism plays no significant role in the rejuvenation of the statist class, in contrast to other ruling classes in history, adds to this impression. And again, I don't think that's actually true. I think that what it does seem to be the case is that in the Soviet Union, the basis of the new class, I think a large part of it would be called, part of the new intelligentsia, this class of people who fundamentally operate in like a managerial function within the society and get certain privileges from that. They and a lot of them being formerly working class or being formerly peasants, right? The industrialization drive, requires people with industrial expertise, for instance, right? Scientific expertise, know-how, and the Soviet Union funded that, and that was kind of the basis of the kind of like new intelligentsia, which I think you could call like the Stalinist middle class. You hear this term sometimes, middle class Stalinism. Stalin is like the Soviet middle class, and this is, I think, what is being referred to here. And definitely, these people did pass on their privileges to their children. They might not have been able to just hand them their office or something like that, and they might not be able to hand in the way that like a capitalist can just transfer his business to like his sons or some shit like that. But there was definitely a degree to which, due to their excessive income, especially, I think there's a decrease in the 1930s, or as opposed to I think initially there was kind of an increase in the amount that the state was willing to pay for people to go to school or subsidize education in order to feed industrialization. But I think that kind of scaled back, right? In the same way that I think like rations were scaled back in order, and like more and more like wages came to be like the dominant way that people had access to the means of consumption in the Soviet Union. And that I think that like this there was a degree, I think this is very naive, and it's kind of crazy that you would say something like this. Maybe he'll elaborate on why it's not exactly true later. But like definitely by the 1960s, it was clear that the generations who had achieved some kind of success within the Stalinist framework in the 1930s and 1940s were able to pass on privileges to their children, getting them better access to schooling and things of that sort, due to their disproportionate income vis-a-vis the working class. Anyway, the observation that nepotism plays no significant role in the rejuvenation of the statist class, in contrast to other ruling classes in history, adds to this impression. Yet the state apparatus does in fact control production and dispose of surplus value, primarily in its own interest, and is therefore de facto the owner of the means of production, regardless of any formal legal decrees to the contrary. We need not puzzle over the concept of collective class ownership, for it has not been unknown in history. I again cite the example of the feudal church ownership. One would have to have a vivid imagination, indeed, to believe that the proletariat is the ruling class in the Stalinist system. This ideological myth's strength, from the fact that on occasion an occasional worker does enter the state apparatus. I would say that this is depending on what you're concerned by the state apparatus, you're talking about like the top levels of the Politburo or something like that, or they enter into collective management. Like I think like for instance Khrushchev, I think had a pretty humble beginnings. Like if it depends on what you're talking about in this instance, but definitely workers were entering the state apparatus. There is a degree. There's this term. It's not from this time, so we can forgive him a little bit. But like I was saying before with about the Stalinist middle class. It's kind of a tricky term, or the new, or what Bedeline calls the new intelligentsia, or other people call it the new intelligentsia, or whatever. Is that they when they talk about the Soviet Union being a affirmative action state, right? So it did give certain segments of the working class and peasantry, by no means all of them, right, certain access to means and incentivize them as well to enter places within the hierarchy. And Donald Filter, there's an interview with him, about Stalinist industrialization on the Social Histories of Revolution channel, where he talks about how, the problem with like a pyramid, that however permeable it is still a pyramid, right? And you can say the same thing about the capitalist society, right? Like, people act as though, sometimes you'll hear like leftists, in order to like challenge right-wing arguments, say that like kind of act as though meritocracy or something like that is entirely a myth, right? There's absolutely no meritocracy, as opposed to viewing it as scales. And especially in other places besides the United States, say in France and in like Scandinavia and those places, the hierarchy of those societies is way more climbable than that of the United States, where I live, for instance. There is a degree of like meritocracy, right? There is a degree of it, and there's a degree of which doesn't, obviously, you can go all kinds of places if you think there's a meritocracy, right? Anyone who's poor is an idiot or biologically defective or mentally weak or some shit like that, some kind of like social Darwinist kind of thing. But I don't think that's necessarily the case. Like, if you say that there's some kind of if you say there's some kind of meritocracy, that does not mean that you think that like poor people had it coming or some shit like that. And it most certainly doesn't say that like that inequality or classes should exist. Of course, that's not the same. But anyway, there is a degree to which workers were able to enter the state apparatus, right? From what I understand, at least. Do not such workers, it may be asked, represent above all the interests of the working class? But first we may note that there are fewer workers than is usually supposed, and that the further the revolution recedes into the past, the fewer workers there are relative to other groups. Moreover, it doesn't occur to anyone to deny that the bourgeoisie is the ruling class in a capitalist society, solely on the grounds that an occasional worker breaks into its ranks, albeit less frequently than he penetrates the Stalinist state apparatus. The bourgeoisie renews itself as a class primarily by means of inheritance, while this does not play a significant role in the case of the statist class. As it comes into being as a consequence of the degeneration of the revolutionary state apparatus, it is natural for the statist class to recruit workers in a deliberate manner. It thus reaffirms its status as the representative of the working class, but it is naive to believe that these workers retain the same attitudes and interests permanently. Like I said, it's absolutely right. Enter the middle class, and you get a little more conservative. And I think that was kind of like the popular support for Stalinism. I think a lot of the popular support within the Soviet Union for Stalinism did not come from the working class, but rather from this kind of like new intelligentsia. Former people from the working class who were able to have a more comfortable lifestyle than the working class, and certainly the kolkhoz farmers. Anyway, but it's naive to believe that these workers retain the same attitudes and interests permanently. A quote Marxist who does so must also hold that one's consciousness is determined primarily by his past and not by his present social existence! Exclamation point. I remember I had this, one of the things that really drove me to exploring the Russian question in greater depth, and part of the motivation for my, the topic of my master's thesis, is running into, I went back to college kind of late. I was in like my late 20s. I went back to college. And, when I got into radical politics, say when I was like a teenager, I was like 17, became interested in it. Like, I wasn't particularly socially, I wasn't an activist. I just had like opinions or whatever. And which is true to this day. I'm not an activist. Unless you consider talking some kind of activism, which, anyway. Is that when I went back to class, I didn't realize, I never really come in contact with, the mass degree of, tankyism. That was prevalent upon people among students who had socialist or who had left-wing leanings. And I remember this guy tried to prove to me that there wasn't the bureaucracy in the Stalinist period was so overrated because people who were in the bureaucracy came from workers' backgrounds. Fucking so stupid. God, that guy sucked. Finally, it must also be noted that the social origin of members of a given social group is not one of Marx's criteria for identification of the ruling class. Short of irony or cynicism, there is no sense in which the working class in the Stalinist system may be called the ruling class, not even in the most liberal sense of the term. The working class is completely subjugated and severely exploited. Not only is it barred from controlling production and making decisions concerning the distribution of surplus value, either directly or indirectly, it does not even possess certain rights that it has realized in capitalism, the rights to choose one's employer, to negotiate over working conditions and wage levels. And again, this will be kind of one of the reasons why certain people within, I don't know what Stojanović's trajectory is after the fall of the disintegration of Yugoslavia. I don't know if he becomes a liberal or a conservative or a nationalist or anything like that. But I know within like bureaucratic collectivism and stuff, and a lot of those people, or some of those people, moved into a democratic socialist direction or a social democratic direction as opposed to like a revolutionary third campus direction. So there's kind of like a split within the bureaucratic collectivist camp between like those who continue to adhere to the third camp, neither Washington nor Moscow, to a position of critical support for Washington. Part of the reason for this, part of the rationale for this, is like this extreme, at least within, like, say, Sweden, or even in the United States or Great Britain or something, that you can kind of have this, like, semi-powerful trade union movements, right? You can think of, like, the power of trade unions in, like, say, like the 60s in Britain and other places in Western Europe, for that matter, right? In West Germany and stuff like that. At least in these places, you can actively fight for better working conditions for the working class without being risked of facing a massacre. Obviously, repression is still used and police violence is still used in some instances, but at the same time, there's not the kind of massacres that you see even as late as, like, I can't remember the place where it happened. It was some kind of like parochial town, but there was like a strike, I think, of like miners or something in the Soviet Union where they shot and killed like I don't know, I think it was like, I can't remember, but it was like, I think it was like 50 people or something like that, 50 strikers. I have to look this up. Yeah, okay. Yeah, the Novocherkassk massacre. Carried out by... how many people died? 107 imprisoned, 7 executed, dozens killed and wounded. This is according to Wikipedia. 100 people were convicted in show trials. 7 sentenced to death for a strike. Granted these kind of conditions, this led to like a kind of like a critical support for the Western camp within the Cold War, right? Was that you still had this flexibility to advocate for the conditions of the direct producers, whereas in Stalinism and Stalinist states, you just faced largely just faced repression. Anyway, in this respect, we might draw an analogy between Stalinism and feudalism. In Stalinism, in addition to the reification of the labor force, the workers themselves are reified to a significant degree. Independent organizations that might really represent the right of the proletariat are unknown in Stalinism. Nominal workers' organizations do exist, but in practice are nationalized and transformed into transmission belts of the statist class. Work is done not only under economic pressure, but under strong non-economic pressure as well. As for the peasantry, it becomes part of the proletariat and fully develops statism through nationalization of land holdings and control of agriculture. As such, the peasantry is employed by the ruling class. Some analysts and critics prefer to speak of a ruling caste rather than of a ruling class. That's something that you'd hear like Trotsky say, ruling caste, ruling stratum. But this is really an overly free use of an otherwise quite precise sociological concept. A caste is an exclusive sociological grouping based upon inheritance. Surely the ruling statist group does not have these characteristics. Many Marxists apply only the mildest analytical critical term to this group, calling it a social stratum. But this procedure only plays into the hands of the ideological mystification of the ruling class. Trotsky. in state socialism, one can indeed talk meaningfully about the working class and the stratum of the working class's representatives, the state officials. But in Stalinist society, where there are concentrations of political and economic power, wealth, and social prestige on the one hand, and of subjugation and exploitation on the other, the real relations between the ruling group and the proletariat can only be seen in terms of the following categorical symmetry: statist class, working class. The statist class, quote, adheres firmly to Marxism, adapted, of course, to meet the circumstances as its ideology. The statist class uses the Marxist interpretation of socialism as the stage of preparation for classless society in order to lower an ideological veil over class reality. When the Constitution of the USSR was proclaimed in 1937, I thought it was proclaimed earlier than that. I have to look it up, because Trotsky wrote the Revolution Trade in 1936, and he definitely talks about the Soviet Constitution. So am I making shit up? Yeah, it's Soviet Constitution 1936. Good. When the Constitution of the USSR was proclaimed in 1937, actually 1936, Stalin declared that the exploiting class had disappeared forever. And this at the very time that the new ruling class was passing through an intensive formative period. For Stalin, with the ruling class that he's referring to, is the same ruling class that Trotsky thought was going to lead to a possible counter-revolution in the 1920s, right? The so-called kulaks and the netmen. Social differentiation, I believe social differentiation among the peasantry was actually very slight, and that any kind of, class war in the countryside was like an artificial state institution that did not emerge organically out of agricultural communities in the Soviet Union in the 1920s. So that's who Stalin would be referring to, right? This old class, this class that was steeped in private property, the remnants of private property in the Soviet Union, not this new class which was based upon the holding of state office. Anyway, when the Constitution of the USSR was proclaimed, Stalin declared that the exploiting class had disappeared forever, and this at the very time that the new ruling class was passing through an intensive formative period. This is hardly unusual. Quote, for each new class which puts itself in the place of one ruling class before this new class is compelled, merely in order to carry through this new class's aim, to represent this new class's interest as the common interest of all the members of society, ... This new class will give this new class's ideas the form of universality and represent this new class's ideas as the only rational, universally valid ideas. End quote. Marx, the German ideology. The statist class modestly legitimizes the statist class itself as the representative of the class which it actually exploits. As difficult as it is for a Marxist to conceive the possibility of a socialist revolution degenerating into a new form of class exploitative society, it is even harder for him to admit that it has actually happened. A Marxist thinks that his admission would dim the further prospects of socialism. The accurate observation that strong, although suppressed elements of socialism do exist in Stalinist society, above all in the working class, only reinforces his emotive resistance. And that was sometimes one of the things that Trotsky would say, in addition to the state property, which is actually fundamentally the only thing that he thought constituted a worker state by the end of his life, was that was the memories of the working class, the memories of October, which were still beating in their hearts. That was a instance of the way that the Soviet Union was still had socialist content. And indeed, they would, even like his adherents after Trotsky died, like the orthodox Marxists would say things about like, oh yeah, the proof of the working class character of the Soviet state, despite the Stalinist bureaucratic, totalitarian, murderous clique that rules it, is still a working class because there's so much morale is so high among the Red Army, which I think is a historically doubtful proposition. I'm not exactly sure, but also the morale of an army or the popular support at any given moment of a state does not grant it that state any kind of particular content, and that's one of the things that tankies often do is like, people love Stalin, or like the people love Stalin, and when he died there was all these tears, which did happen, of course, and there was also like parades and stuff, and there was like people who would who enthusiastically fought in World War II in the Soviet Union and stuff like that, usually with nationalist intentions as opposed to nationalist feeling as opposed to socialist feeling, which was definitely played up 100% by the Stalinist apparatus. But again, to like just say that like, the people like something doesn't really speak at all to the democratic content of what the people are liking, right? If you think of like fascism or any kind of like populist movement, there is like popular support amongst the population in a lot of cases, in a lot of places, in a lot of instances. That doesn't at all speak to the democratic or socialist content of what is being supported, But that's not what he's talking about here. I'm just going off. I've already ruined this video, so I'm going to ruin it some more. The degree of violence which Stalinism had to employ attests to the strength of the socialist resistance to statist decadence. Still, we ought not confuse the existence of forces that resist the establishment of a socioeconomic system or that hope to change it with the nature of the system itself. We should call the Stalinist type of statism oligarchic. The monopoly of the ruling class, economic, political, cultural, moral, is direct and full. In addition to the conditions enumerated earlier in this chapter, another role in the construction of this type of statism was played by the model of the ruling Stalinist party, permanently based upon the principles of strict centralism, hierarchy, and the absolute monopolization of social life. The party naturally aspired to fashion the entire social system in its own image, but more about this in the next chapter. It's actually kind of interesting that about this book so far is that it's written in it's written by a Yugoslavian, right? And it has not mentioned Gilas. It has not mentioned Gilas's new class. And, all this like talk about the authenticity of Leninism as a revolutionary project and a revolutionary politics and stuff like that. I wonder, there's a degree to which I feel like that it's kind of like playing to the status quo of Yugoslavia a little bit. I don't know if that's true or not. But I know that by this point, like, I can't remember when this was written, I think in 1967. By this point, Gilas was like, was getting deep in his critique. I have some pieces about Gilas. I should read the new class. I don't know why I haven't read the new class, but I should read the new class. The book that he wrote. He's very interesting because unlike Trotsky, his like critique of like the reality that was existing around him was like while he was like still in a very like powerful position within the Yugoslav state, right? I think he was like up there with like Tito and stuff. He was like a very important figure and was like critiquing, kind of like lost his social status by critiquing Yugoslavia while he was in power. Right, and maybe once there was like he was getting flack from the party, it like kind of like set the fire further for him to like, oh, you're gonna criticize this? Well, you know what? I'm gonna go even fucking harder in the paint and criticize even more deeply. But he's very interesting in the sense that as opposed to Trotsky, he did it while he was in power. whereas Trotsky was like exiled from the country, um, and like took him a long time for him to be like that, form like a real deep critique of the Soviet Union. When he no longer viewed it as reformable, and he no longer viewed the left opposition as like an unjustly expelled legitimate opposition within the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which he only abandoned after the Nazis took power, and not even after the Nazis took power precisely, but like he still hung on for a little while after that before he openly declared that the left opposition was no longer an opposition movement, but like an alternative to the mainstream communist movement, and he started advocating political revolution in the Soviet Union. But it took him like a while, and a lot of repression, and a lot of it took a while for the degree to which he was for him to lose hope. And I need to say, large extent, he never really did lose hope. But hope that he thought he was gonna. They all thought they were going to be like eventually the third the CPSU, Stalin, and all that were gonna it's kind of seems so naive, but this is definitely the impression I get, that they're basically going to see the error of their ways and readmit the left opposition, readmit Trotsky back into the country, and give them and readmit them as like a legitimate place within the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And he broke with a lot of people. For instance, he broke with Hugo Orbán because he put his Lenin Bund in a competitive, competed or put the left oppositionist party in Germany, the Lenin Bund, in elections against the Communist Party, and Trotsky kind of disowned him for that, right? Because in Trotsky's mind, this was it was acting as an alternative as opposed to like an opposition within, right? In that sense, but yeah, just to say that like the Gilas had a different trajectory. Gilas lived a lot longer. I don't know what he was definitely like, to my impression of him, he was way less steeped in like the theoretical aspect of Marxism than, or at least traditional Marxism as Trotsky was. But yeah, I think he became like kind of like a liberal towards like the end of his life. So like stopped identifying as a socialist at all, not a Marxist or not a Leninist but yeah, I don't know why Gilas hasn't been mentioned. Especially considering that there seems like to be a good degree of overlap between what's being said here and what I understand Gilas to be. I think Gilas viewed the political class as the economic ruling class. It seems very odd that Gilas isn't mentioned at all. Anyway, in order to avoid any misunderstanding at the same time, to neutralize another possible objection to my thesis, I wish to emphasize that we may appreciate the progressiveness of statism over capitalism of Tsarist Russia without any sense of discomfort. All right? I guess you could say from that what it was. It says, nevertheless, statism did produce a great deal of progress in Russia. And see, this is another thing that kind of is like is a particular thing, right? That's one of the debates within like the Russian question, whether the USSR is progressive or not, and what was the nature of this of its industrialization, right? Eventually, people are going to state capitalists, especially, are going to criticize the nature of this accumulation process, this capital accumulation process in the Soviet Union is based on the extreme exploitation of the working class and the extreme exploitation of the direct producers, and also that the industrial growth that it pumped out was unsustainable, often very shoddy, and it didn't lead in any kind of way to like a lessening of exploitation after the fact, right? Um, like that was one of the things to say is like, yeah, it was like it was an extreme state of exploitation that like literally killed people. It was so exploitative that it starved large sections of the population to death. That's how exploitative the first 5-year plans were. Anyway, so certain people say, oh, well, it's progressive or whatever, or that nationalized property was inherently progressive, and stuff like that. But yeah, I think that that's one of the things that I think most people who adopt state capitalism viewed the industrial gains of the Soviet Union as capitalist gains, with the human consequences, and even worse than in capitalism in a lot of cases, that are to be expected from that. Also, it's like based upon, and it's like it's kind of like weird when people say, "Oh, it's more progressive." It's like, yeah, well, you could say that like, yeah, like any state that had more industrial production than Tsarist Russia, which again, he's saying it's capitalist, should be really cautious about that, especially if you're considering the Russian Empire as a whole and not just the eastern portion of it, which was still, the western portion of it, which was still largely agrarian, especially if you consider like the whole swath of what constituted Russia. There was also extreme industrial development, and this is one of the things that Ryan Dunevich says, like, yeah, there was also like a concurrent with like the industrial development in the Soviet Union. There was also like the extreme development of Japan's economy at the same time, the extreme industrialization of that. But you don't really see people talking, just sing, like socialists singing the high praises of the progressive nature of like the Meiji Restoration and the industrialization drive that came out of it. Like no one says that. So it's weird to insist on the progressiveness, even relative progressiveness of Stalinism, and especially when you say progressive and you're only taught when like. It's like a very limited notion of progress. I think that, like, as opposed to a lot of socialists, especially people like who were influenced by like, I don't know, a lot of like post-colonial and decolonial theory and stuff, and other groups as well. They kind of like critique the whole notion of progress. I do think things are progressive, but I think progressive should mean like emancipatory, and something's progressive relative to something else if it's more emancipatory. I don't think you can say that about Stalinism. I don't think Stalinism was more emancipatory than say the Soviet than like pre-Bolshevik Russia, right? Like if like Tsarism was extremely reactionary. Did it kill as many people as Stalinism did? That's a question. The October Revolution did indeed run out of steam after a while. Nevertheless, statism did produce a great deal of progress in Russia. Our concern here is with a completely ascendant ruling class. The USSR has been transformed from backward Russia into one of two economic, political, cultural, and military superpowers of the world. Its share in world industry has grown from 3% to 20%, and its gross product is more than half that of the United States. While Russia's population was among the most illiterate and uneducated in the world, the USSR today ranks among the highest both in its level of literacy and in the number of personnel working in the cultural, artistic, technical, and medical fields. Its free child care and medical and social care, as well as its schooling, are among the best in the world. In no other country has the emancipation of women proceeded with such speed. The above evidence is usually justly supplemented by citing the fact that the USSR played the greatest role in defeating Nazism in World War II. One of the other things is that the emancipation of women, you should definitely put a big bracket around that, especially with the illegalization of abortion services in the Soviet Union, right? That accompanied Stalinism, as well as to just like very regressive ideas about the family and the home. And also, again, free childcare when maybe after World War II, but like in the period leading up to it and during World War II, especially if you were a child of a peasant or the working class, it was definitely not a particularly rosy experience by any means. Also, if you're talking about the Nazis defeating the USSR defeating Nazis in World War II, obviously that's a preferred outcome to the Nazis defeating the Soviet Union, I would say. But we should also consider the fact that when the USSR defeated the Nazis, it also conquered half of Europe as well. And leading up to World War II, it was an ally of Nazi Germany. It didn't like the people get confused sometimes about the nature of the Nazi-Soviet pact, as if it was like, for one, they had this idea, right, that it was just like a temporary, the Soviet Union forced into it, biding its time before it would ultimately go to war at the Nazi period. When the Nazis finally invaded the Soviet Union, the establishment, including Stalin, was fucking shocked. They thought they were so surprised by it. Stalin spent like a week in bed. There was no indication within the top ranks of the party that they were really prepared for any kind of imminent warfare with Nazi Germany. Also, the other thing to mention is that the USSR, what's it called? I don't know the words, or the secret protocols or whatever you want to call it. But the agreement between them in this pact was that they would basically partition Eastern Europe between themselves. So the Soviet Union went on an expansionist adventures into Poland, the Baltic states, and Finland, right? At the same time that the Nazis were doing that in an agreement with one another, right? And in fact, the expansion of the USSR, if you listen to the piece I have on Bedlam, I don't know if it'll be up first, but basically the expansionism actually didn't really help the Soviet Union at all. In fact, it did just kind of like thinned out its resources, and the Nazis were able to just like march like way past the Soviet borders, like very, very easily. So there's always this kind of, and I think this is one of the problems, and this is a side note, just a tangential note. I think this is one of the problems why like people really actually come have a difficulty with getting down to like the actual like the historical significance and the actual processes of fascism and the relation of the left to fascism and anti-Semitism, is because they view the USSR as this great like victor. It did beat the Nazis. That is the fact. But also that's too, and the Nazis did repress the communist parties, and it was anti-Bolshevik. And it gained a lot of its it's had a lot of its impetus, like the anti-leftist things, right? It's a completely reactionary, 100% reactionary project, right? So so a lot of leftists, I think, get onto a kind of like use the fact that they fought the Nazis, the great anti-fascist war or whatever, to not actually understand the way more complicated relationship between the USSR and fascism, Nazism, specifically Nazism, to that period. And the very, very minimal attention paid by the USSR and the left in general to the significance of anti-Semitism within the Nazi project. It wasn't just like a propaganda trick. It was a real conviction on the part of it. So there's just kind of like way too much of like a rosy kind of romanticization of the Soviet Union's international role in the 1940s. That's like it's very problematic to just be like, the USSR defeated the Nazis. Well, after kind of trying to partition Eastern Europe with them, and it's the same thing also, like, oh yeah, like there was this brutal industrialization which set the preconditions for there's this industrialization. The industrialization of the Stalin period set the preconditions that allowed the USSR to defeat Nazi Germany. It's like, yeah, that's true. I mean, the increased industrial capacity definitely helped. Concurrently, however, that's justifying something after the fact, right? And acting as if that was like the whole thing was to fight fascism, and it wasn't. However, even given the great progress made by the USSR, it does not at all follow that Stalinism was justified. The correct question does not involve how much progress there was, but whether there was an optimum degree of progress. Would there have been less progress or more had the Stalinist path not been chosen? Obviously, any answer to this question can only be hypothetical. And I think, as a side, keep talking, but as a side note for myself, I think that there would have been less progress, right? But again, we should keep in note that this progress that's being spoken of, this industrialization that was achieved so fast, was at a tremendous human cost. And so that the alternative really, the only alternative really that could have been different is one, if the bureaucracy somehow increased democratization of the Soviets, but also like it would have, of necessity, demanded, if not the extension of the NEP, which is what people like John Eric Merritt say, which I think is there's definitely some truth to that, but definitely a more cautious and balanced and slower paced industrialization than what Stalinism sought to do. Yeah. And I think the progress of the industrialization part, the industrialization and the social consequences are what Stalinism was. Anyway, obviously any answer to this question can only be hypothetical. How does this progress look as viewed from the other side? The final balance also includes the millions of victims of Stalinism, there you are, the annihilation of the commanding cages of the Red Army, and the real unpreparedness of the USSR to defend itself, for which it had to pay with an inordinate amount of human death and material destruction. The disarray of the Communist parties unable to organize resistance to Nazism and thus help Russia. It should be noted that the USSR disbanded the Polish Communist Party in 1938 before it even invaded Poland. I think on the grounds that it was too infested with Trotskyism or something like that, or would have, in some sense, stood as a barrier to like its expansion plans. I'm not exactly sure on the details, but it basically destroyed the Polish Communist Party. An agriculture ruined by the bloody period of collectivization from which it did not recover for a long time. I'm pretty sure it didn't recover. I think it was kind of consistently lagging. The excessively low level of social science and philosophy. The stagnation of individual arts, also due to their vulgar politicization. And finally, the subordination of the international communist movement to the Stalinist party with serious consequences, especially for the internal development of the Eastern European countries. The conclusion to be drawn from all this is that the USSR would have been stronger in a political, cultural, and moral sense had the forces of Stalinism not triumphed. But Stalinism is usually justified not only by pointing to the progress Stalinism achieved, but also by asserting that Stalinism was necessary. Footnote, even if this were correct, of course, it would not follow that Stalinism is a form of socialism. End footnote. Stalin himself endeavored time and again to explain his policies by citing the situation of the USSR. Thus, in 1939, Stalin subjected to criticism this famous thought of Engels, quote, "The first act by virtue of which the state really constitutes the state's self, the representative of the whole society, the taking possession of the means of production in the name of society, that is at the same time its last independent act as a state. State interference in social relations becomes, in one domain after another, superfluous, and then dies out of itself." End quote. Engels, Anti-Drawing. In his report to the 18th Party Congress in 1939, Stalin said, quote, "Is this proposition of Engels correct? Yes, it is correct, but only on one of two conditions. One, if we study the socialist state only from the angle of the internal development of the country, abstracting ourselves in advance from the international factor, isolating for the convenience of investigation the country and the state from the international situation. Or two, if we assume that socialism is already victorious in all countries, or in the majority of countries, that a socialist encirclement exists instead of a capitalist encirclement, that there is no more danger in foreign attack, and that there is no more need to strengthen the army and the state. Well, but what if socialism has been victorious only in one country? And if in view of this it is quite impossible to abstract oneself from international conditions, what then? Engels' formula does not furnish an answer to this question. As a matter of fact, Engels did not set himself this question, and therefore could not have given an answer to it. Engels proceeds from the assumption that that socialism has already been victorious in all countries, or in a majority of countries, more or less simultaneously. Consequently, Engels is not here investigating any specific socialist state of any particular country, but the development of the socialist state in general. On the assumption that socialism has been victorious in a majority of countries, according to the formula, quote, assuming that socialism is victorious in a majority of countries, what changes must the proletarian socialist state undergo? End quote. Stalin. Report to the 18th Party Congress. And granted, Stalin was a believer in socialism in one country, right? Further, quote, and the function of our socialist state changed accordingly. The function of military suppression inside the country ceased, died away, for exploitation had been abolished. There were no more exploiters left, and so there was no one to suppress. It's fucking hilarious. In fact, in place of this function of suppression, the state acquired the function of protecting socialist property from thieves and pilferers of the people's property. The function of defending the country from foreign attack fully remained, as did the punitive organs and the intelligence service, which are indispensable for the detection and punishment of the spies, assassins, and wreckers sent into our country by foreign espionage services. The function of economic organization and cultural education by the state organs also remained and was developed to the full. Now the main task of our state inside the country is the work of peaceful economic organization and cultural education. End quote. Stalin. Report to the 18th Party Congress. The sophistry in this line of argument is recognized long ago. Stalin sought to prove that the Soviet state would not wither away in any of its functions. 1. Defense of the order from external and internal enemies. 2. Economic organization. 3. Cultural and educational organization. And therefore I refer to the existence of a capitalist encirclement. But capitalist encirclement is reason to retain only the first function, but not any of the others. Does it really follow from the premise that the USSR was at the time the only socialist country in the world, and that it was menaced by the capitalist countries, that the strengthening of the state, instead of the development of social self-government in economics, education, and culture was necessary? It is interesting that some of the most serious students of Stalinism who are not Stalinist support the view that Stalinism was necessary. Isaac Deutscher, in Isaac Deutscher's famous 3-volume biographical study of Trotsky, asserts that Stalinism was necessary in order to overcome the resistance of the masses to industrialization. Check out the piece on this channel. Who is it by? Julius Jacobson. Is Julius Jacobson? Isaac Deutscher, The Anatomy of an Apologist. I also have a piece that's a review by Max Shachtman. I have a couple pieces by Max Shachtman, I think, on Deutscher on this channel. Anyway. Isaac Deutscher, in his famous 3-volume biographical study of Trotsky, asserts that Stalinism was necessary in order to overcome the resistance of the masses to industrialization. Yeah, and that's why you can kind of say that, like, post-Trotsky, Trotskyism especially, I don't think it's reducible to Isaac Deutscher, of course. Obviously, Isaac Deutscher was not really a politician. He was like an independent scholar working in the UK at the time. But a lot of them were kind of just like critical supporters of Stalinism as opposed to like opponents of Stalinism. always had to sing its high praises, and just kind of act as if as if like the totalitarian bureaucracy were just kind of like an epiphenomenon that didn't have like deep roots in the society as a whole. And it should be noted, just in order to talk shit, is that Isaac Deutscher, obviously they had a lot of different people in this channel, so I don't want to say anyone who's participates in it or whatever is has his opinion or whatever, but that is the politics of people like Tariq Ali and Perry Anderson and other people that are associated with New Left Review. That was one of the most important people in their trajectory, including in their political development, Isaac Deutscher, and his assessment of the Cold War situation and his assessment of Stalin and Trotsky and all that stuff. That he was like their guy. He was like their he was extremely influential in that group of intellectuals in that period, as well as Ernest Mandel. So they were kind of like the what I would say the most Stalin-friendly portion of Trotskyism was the influence for New Left Review, and also New Left books. And as you know, New Left books became Verso books. So anyway, nationalized property had to be protected, even from the working class, by all means available. Look up the Spikelets laws, which is a really draconian set of laws to protect private property. The analogy is between the Stalinist industrialization and the area of the most intensive expropriation of the peasantry in England is very, very impressive. Nationalized property had to be protected even from the working class by all means available. Stalin, through his dictatorship, was the bearer of harsh historical necessity. When industrialization was completed, despotism necessarily came into conflict with the new economic level which demanded democratization. It is striking how Deutscher inversely applied Marx's thesis on the necessity of socialism and socialist democracy in highly developed countries. According to Deutscher, socialist revolution in underdeveloped countries inevitably leads to a Stalinist or similar type of dictatorship. Yeah. And he definitely, I would categorize Isaac Deutscher in a kind of a similar vein to some other people. There's this, I can't remember where I heard it before, but reform communist, right? So the Trotskyist thesis, even in the more conservative England, is that a revolution of a sort was necessary in the Soviet Union, right? A political revolution, which overthrew the bureaucracy, basically purged. Basically do a massive purge of the state apparatus and the party. Implement a bunch of reforms to increase democratization and equality and stuff. Deutscher did not accept that, to my understanding. Deutscher viewed that now that the productive forces have been so developed within the Soviet Union that democratization would automatically follow. And I think that that's kind of ridiculous. That's ridiculous. But there is a degree to which there was some kind of changes that were happening in the later 1950s, while not substantial changes. The death of Stalin did lead to some degree of opening up, right? There was a degree to which the bureaucracy itself was less subordinated to any particular individual. It was still a class. It didn't cease being an exploitative authoritarian class society. That was very draconian. As I mentioned before, that massacre of workers took place in the Khrushchev era and was hidden. And obviously, there is something to be said about the 20th. However, limited the critique is, Khrushchev's secret speech to the 20th Party Congress about the crimes of Stalinism. There was some degree of changes in the post-Stalinist era, but none that would have been as radical as what Trotsky was advocating at all. So Deutscher was definitely a reform communist as opposed to he's almost not even a Trotskyist, and at least, well, if you think political revolution against Stalinism and the system of Stalinism, not just against Stalin himself, but against the bureaucracy in order to achieve equality and substantial social, some kind of more substantial democracy, if you think that's like an important part of Trotskyism or what it meant to be a Trotskyist in the period that Deutscher was writing, I think you could say that he was not quite a Trotskyist. It is striking how Deutscher inversely applied Marx's thesis on the necessity of socialism and socialist democracy in highly developed countries. According to Deutscher, socialist revolution in underdeveloped countries inevitably leads to a Stalinist or similar type of dictatorship. And, to be fair, though, there's definitely a degree to which Trotsky shared that position, right? Trotsky viewed the Soviet Union as the root of the bureaucracy. Basically, if you look at the revolution betrayed, for instance, is the fact of like shortage in articles of consumption, right? When the store is full, no one has to wait in line, but when the stores are not full, people have to wait. Obviously, a line forms, and if the stores are really not full, like really long lines form, and if in order for lines form, there has to be a policeman there to keep order, to keep people from killing each other and trying to access these scarce level of goods. And obviously, the person who's policing this scarcity is going to make sure that he is fed first, and he's going to decide who gets to eat and who gets what. Basically, Trotsky had a very similar argument. Obviously, I think he thought like things were a little more open than that, but he definitely thought that the source of like the Soviet like Thermidor, which he thought took place in 1924 when the left opposition lost power, not when the left opposition was kicked out of the party and then out of the country and all that and rendered illegal, but like when it lost control of the apparatus after Lenin's death. That's when he thought Thermidor happened, and he thought that Thermidor was due to this bureaucratization process, which is fundamentally due to the USSR's isolation and scarcity. So it's definitely related to Trotsky. Anyway, the problem of the historical necessity of Stalinism demands more detailed consideration. Here I can only point to some conceptual confusions and outline the direction in which one ought to look for the answer. Adherents of the view that Stalinism was necessary see Stalinism as the sole possibility under given conditions. They fail to take account of the human factor in explaining the historical process, which to them seems to be but a series of events upon which people can have no significant impact. In their view, only one real possibility confronted the Bolsheviks, precisely that possibility which the Stalinists recognized and confirmed. It would not have been objectively possible in the conditions which reigned at the time of the dominant Stalinist forces to select another path of social development, and any attempt to burden them with the responsibility for what happened is senseless. The only, quote, guilty party was the objective situation. The initial premise itself of this line of reasoning is fallacious. After the October Revolution, there were two possibilities, accepting victory of the classical counter-revolution. The first possibility is the total and permanent nationalization of all social life, simultaneously with the alienation of the state from society. The second possibility is the further strengthening of the influence of the working class and of all the working people upon the state and the development of social self-government. Our critique of the thesis of the necessity of Stalinism can acknowledge that in the conditions of the times, the second possibility had fewer real prospects. Nor is he bothered by the assertion that in those conditions, the development of social self-government based upon worker self-management, a condition for the victory of the second possibility, would most likely have been fairly slow. It is enough for him to say that this path was a real possibility. In fact, it was not only a possibility but a strong tendency as well. Evidence of this was the existence of Soviets of workers, peasants, and soldiers at all levels of social organization. And right, remember that was the whole impetus of, that was one of the key slogans of the Bolsheviks at the time: all power to the Soviets. And then when the Kronstadt insurgency happened, and they said all power to the Soviets, they were shot down, and not just shot down, but a lot of the people, I believe, a lot of the families that were in Kronstadt. A lot of the population of Kronstadt was deported after, in the immediate years following the Kronstadt insurgency, right? So, that was the whole purpose of the revolution, was to give all power to the Soviets, right? And what it really did was only give power to one party of the Soviets, who ostensibly were the only real Soviet party. The rest being rendered illegal: the leftist Tsars, Mensheviks, anarchists, and of the other people that would have had a stake who would have had some kind of popularity in the Soviets. They were all made illegal, and not only were those extra parties made illegal, but also factions were barred within the Bolshevik Party itself already in 1921. So it preceded Stalinism by a country mile. The dilemma which we were discussing here evoked bitter discussion in the struggle within the party. The Stalinists knew very well that the path opposite to the one they advocated was a real possibility, and they, therefore, used a great deal of guile and brutality in the struggle with their opponents, as did the Bolshevik Party itself in this early period, as was just stated. At the crossroads described here, the decisive role was played by the Stalinist group, which is strong enough to impose its conceptions upon the rest of the party. Thus we can justly hold the Stalinists to have been responsible. The assertion that Stalinism was objectively necessary is acceptable only if this subjective factor is taken into account as one of the decisive factors. But this is merely an ex post facto explanation which does not deny the existence of various possibilities, conceptions and their bearers, but which, on the basis of an evaluation of the real forces at the time, merely draws a conclusion about the necessity of the corresponding outcome of struggles among them. No one can have anything against this essentially trivial thesis about the necessity of Stalinism. However, in the previous pages, we have been challenging another thesis that is much more ambitious, incorrect, and dangerous. Section 6. In proposing a supplement to Marx's typology of socioeconomic systems, I have, of course, maintained his classificatory principle, i.e., the basic type of relations of production. Human society is still centered upon the process of material production, and the mode of production, today as in the past, decisively influences the totality of social relations. As long as this is the case, Marx's classificatory principle will remain fundamental. Moreover, it has the added advantage that in the case of statism, this principle makes it possible to destroy this statist myth of socialism. We have already discussed the gain rendered to Marxism by the addition of the category of statism. Are there any other advantages? Marxists often stop dead in their tracks with bewilderment before the worst aspects of Stalinism, asking themselves how such practices are possible in socialism. A satisfactory answer, however, cannot be reached so long as the question is incorrectly posed. We must first ask whether Stalinism is socialism at all. Footnote. Many critics rightly reject the, quote, cult of personality, end quote, explanation, and seek the root of the problem in the nature of the Stalinist social system, but fail to make this final step. A myth has even been created out of the, quote, cult of personality, end quote. Says the key to all mysteries is sought therein. The statist myth of socialism is saved by means of this myth. Trotsky kind of has an interesting kind of like, I don't know, maybe this is a stretch to say, but kind of like a weird Hegelian conception of like the cult of personality. It says that like basically thinks that like using the metaphor of like Bonapartism, which is, in my opinion, in its strict scientific sense of the word, should be restricted to societies based on a capitalist and mode of production, including private property. But anyway, like he thinks that like Stalinism, like Stalin, like almost like it was like Stalin was like the Stalin as a person, as a leader, was the necessary form of appearance, in some sense, of the power of the bureaucracy, and vice versa. Even if the he was like the thing in which the he was kind of like a god, in which all the bureaucracy saw a little piece of themselves, and which Stalin saw a little piece of himself, or some kind of like weird kind of like reflection relationship, or something like that between them, which I think is actually very interesting, because you have to take into account that the Great Terror Obviously, it extended far beyond the top brass of the party and stuff. But a lot of the people that were victimized by the Great Terror were people like very high up in the state apparatus, people who were definitely 100% part of the state and party bureaucracy. Including people like Bukharin and other people that were prominent in like the arts and sciences and stuff like that. Like they didn't have. They might have had a certain class. You might be able to say after the fact that or maybe even at the time, that they had class power, but at the same time, they were fundamentally subordinated politically to Stalin himself in the person, right? So there's definitely a degree to which Stalin, the personal power of Stalin is like a key aspect of Stalinism. It might not be like the only aspect or like the explanatory aspect, but it definitely, in terms of history, Stalin had tremendous personal power. Anyway, unfortunately, some radical critics of Stalinism answered that what we are looking at is, for instance, quote, completely degenerated socialism, end quote. But if an entity degenerates completely, is it not something other than what it had been? I believe that the theoretical solution I have proposed has other advantages. Without it, certain significant aspects of social reality remain poorly articulated or even completely unnoticed. We have already seen that social stratification and social conflict appear in a completely different light when the concept of the ruling statist class is applied. This demythologization could enable the working class to grasp the essence of its position and to take an adequate practical and political stance towards the statist system. Primitive politicratic statism in the USSR, which reached its crisis long ago because it represented a serious fetter on further social development, primarily on economic development, is gradually being transformed into technocratic statism. The core of the statist class will be increasingly composed of technocratic elements. Closely bound to this phenomenon is the economic reform of statism, over which an ideological battle is being conducted at the present. Indeed, Saint-Simon, rather than Marx, would seem to be the ideological precursor of this movement toward technocratic statism. Social systems do not follow one another in a necessary and unilinear pattern. Those who retain such a conception of socioeconomic formations are powerless when confronted by historical reality, and they often solve pseudo problems. And indeed, this is just a side note. This is one of the things I think is unfortunate about a lot of state capitalist theses. Is it kind of like critiques of bureaucratic collectivist thesis? Is that like their main like one of the things they say is that because they're talking about a society that's neither capitalist nor socialist, they're somehow like breaking with Marxism, which I think is a very unfortunate argument. That's just an appeal to authority and an appeal to dogma, as opposed to actually saying why the states. Obviously, they provide other arguments to say like, oh, the state substantially is capitalist for X, Y, and Z reasons. Whether or not you find them convincing is another question. But the idea that like one of the problems with bureaucratic collectivism or this kind of statism that's being put forward by Stojanović is that it's breaking with Marxism because it's like arguing that a society actually exists that is neither capitalist nor socialist. That is how dare they? That's a terrible argument, terrible assumption. But people do make it. Indeed, Trotsky made it, as did other people. I should direct the reader to a by now famous question: how do some countries, quote, skip over, end quote, individual historical stages? Of course, historical events only, quote, skip over, end quote, theoretical schema, not over themselves. There is no strict scheme in history on the basis of which one system necessarily replaces another. We've mainly discussed here that that type of statism which resulted from the degeneration of state socialism. Earlier it was suggested that other varieties of statism can develop in certain decolonized societies. There is also the possibility that individual state capitalist systems may also be transformed gradually into statist systems. In countries with a developed bourgeois democratic tradition, a multi-party system, political liberalism, parliamentarism, statism would most likely retain the forms and achievements of bourgeois political democracy. is precisely such statism in the form of the, quote, welfare state, end quote, which is the programmatic ideal of present-day social democracy. Today, the thesis of the convergence of two systems, capitalist and socialist, is gaining ever greater currency. It seems to me that one can basically speak only of the tendency for state capitalism and statism to converge through the broadening of state property, planning, and social services in the case of the former, and through the rehabilitation of market economy, limited decentralization, and a certain degree of political liberalization in the case of the latter. Historical experience at the time of Marx has shown that there are two possibilities and tendencies inherent in capitalism, i.e. statist, socialist, and not only one as he is taught. And not only one as he had taught. As the epochal dilemma, capitalism or socialism, gradually recedes into the background, we are increasingly compelled to recognize the new epochal dilemma, statism or socialism. The 150th anniversary of Marx's birth came at a time of revolutionary stirrings in Vietnam, Czechoslovakia, and France. By invoking the name of Marx in such diverse conditions, the forces of revolution have once again confirmed that he remains the greatest social thinker of our epoch. Historical events in these countries present us with three kinds of problems. 1. Socialist revolutions in undeveloped countries. 2. Socialist revolutions in countries which declare that they are socialist. 3. Socialist revolutions in highly developed capitalist countries. Marxists have widely debated the prospects for socialism in the modern world. Why do we return to the same theme now? Primarily because of the events in Czechoslovakia and France, a country which people classify as socialist recently introduced revolutionary measures. 5 other, quote, socialist countries carried out aggression against it in order to frustrate these changes. Let's say the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia. On the other hand, in a wealthy capitalist country in May of the same year, events reached such a point that many described the situation as revolutionary. An editorial in the May-June 1968 issue of Sartre's journal, Le Temps Moderne, opened with these ecstatic words, quote, "Let us recognize that socialist revolution is not impossible in a country of Western Europe. Perhaps it is possible even in 2 or 3 as well," end quote. And that would be the general Marcusean thesis that the prospects for working class revolution, with the working class, the revolutionary agent, had radically dimmed, almost beyond possibility in the Western world, which is a very popular idea. Marxism is a revolutionary idea. Marxism must therefore come face to face with this new situation, and it is a situation which both evokes angry despair among Marxists and arouses their greatest hopes. Section 7. Beginning with the bloody collectivization of the peasantry in the USSR at the end of the 1920s, through the mass extermination of communists in the 1930s, the Stalinist offensive against Yugoslavia from 1948 on, the military intervention of Hungary in 1956, and concluding with the occupation of Czechoslovakia, and we only cite a few examples, Marxists have despairingly asked themselves the same question time and again. How is all this possible in socialism? But as the question is incorrectly formulated, no satisfactory answer can be given. We must liberate ourselves from the theoretical framework surrounding this question and simply ask, how is all this possible? Quote, socialism, in which debureaucratization and democratization, economic decentralization, the elimination of political terror and censorship, the introduction of worker self-management, the attainment of national sovereignty, and so on, in which all this represents counter-revolution, can hardly be called socialism in Marx's sense of the term. Nevertheless, many people still trying to convince the Stalinist oligarchy that its aggression against Czechoslovakia dealt a serious blow to the cause of socialism and are naively awaiting some positive results. The case of Czechoslovakia has put all Marxists up against the wall. They must either unmask the statist myth of socialism or whirl helplessly within the circle of questions of how this is possible in socialism. If they opt for the second alternative, they still concede implicitly that socialism is at fault for the Czech case as well. With the aggression against Czechoslovakia, the last socialist veil fell from the face of the oligarchic statist system. Palliative explanations will no longer suffice. The understood formula about the, quote, crisis of socialism, and, quote, lost its persuasiveness long ago, for we are talking about a system which normally and regularly generates such, quote, crises. Nor can we speak any longer of, quote, socialism with severe deformations, end quote, since these deformations are so numerous and of such a nature that they have introduced a new quality, statism. A third commonly employed theoretical crutch has to do with, quote, abuses, end quote, in socialism. But there is a limit to the accumulation of abuses beyond which the character of the entity which is being abused changes. Thus it is high time that we resolve to speak no more of abuses, but rather of the systematic use of social means for the achievement of unsocialist goals. Unless this is understood, the dedication to socialist goals and belief in their attainability leads to their fetishization and becomes transformed into the last defense of a perverted, alienated consciousness of social reality. As if proclaimed goals have the magical power to give a socialist character to the reality that invokes them, even though it does not itself have such a character! Exclamation point. At the same time, this fetishization of socialist goals is a fetishization of the revolutionary past as well. Love for the October Revolution becomes an opiate which prevents Marxists from seeing the present as it really is. The militarist element in the Stalinist oligarchy is now threatening to turn the scales in its favor over the politicratic and technocratic elements. Of course, this sort of naked, brutal, arrogant power would not cease to pose as the vehicle of socialism, truth, and morality. When, as proof of its socialist progress, the USSR's position as a superpower is cited, then an essentially unsocialist criterion of, quote, socialism is being manifested. Must we remind ourselves that the historical experience knows a few examples of similar physical might which might not have ended in aggressiveness. The fact that in 1948 Stalin did not carry out aggression against Yugoslavia, but rather made use of political, economic, diplomatic, and military pressure is of no consequence for the present situation. Check out the piece on this channel by Hal Draper on the Yugoslav-Soviet split. Stalin was so boundlessly sure of himself that at first glance it did not even occur to Stalin that Stalin would have to take military action if Stalin were going to change the situation in Yugoslavia. When Stalin came to his senses later on, it was already too late, since, among other factors, Yugoslavia had broken the economic blockade, while Stalin was afraid of an eventual military clash with the West, which at the same time was immeasurably superior to the USSR in the field of nuclear armament. The non-aligned orientation of a country such as Yugoslavia ought to be permanent, not only out of a desire to contribute thereby to peace and coexistence, but also for the sake of preserving socialist elements within its internal system. At the same time that illusions about the nature of the USSR are renewed, the forces in our country who wanted Yugoslavia de facto to abandon its non-aligned posture began to gain strength. Just as American imperialism tries to hide behind liberal phraseology, quote, the free world and, quote, democracy, when it intervenes in places like Vietnam and the Dominican Republic, so the Stalinist oligarchy invokes the principles of, quote, proletarian internationalism, and, quote, to the same end. However, the mask of, quote, fraternal help, and, quote, was too thin to conceal nationalist hegemony. Therefore, the Stalinist ideologues were compelled to resort to the thesis of, quote, limited sovereignty, end quote, to which, of course, they added Marxist rhetoric about the, quote, socialist community of states, end quote. Only the most incorrigible of Stalinists in the communist movement can believe the mystifications of the, quote, higher interest of socialism, end quote, the hard reasons, end quote, which the, quote, Stalinists have surely had, end quote, when they had decided upon such a serious step as, quote, preventative intervention, end quote, in Czechoslovakia. From 1948 to the present, there has been more than enough occasion to see through this sort of mystification. Stalinism imposed upon Czechoslovakia an alien economic political system of an incomparably lower level than that which would have grown organically out of the country's rich leftist tradition. Rapid de-Stalinization had begun in Czechoslovakia after the January 1968 plenum of the Communist Party. Revolutionary pressure from below combined with significant changes of personnel at the summit of the state and party. Great prospects were created for the victory of real socialism. Abstracting from the international position of Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, the objective, the objective conditions for socialism were much more favorable in Czechoslovakia than in the latter. Czechoslovakia is a developed industrial country with a great culture and a strong democratic tradition, with which its people desire to establish creative critical continuity. For a short time, an enviable level of political democracy is realized. Freedom of criticism of the press, of assembly, legal security of citizens, and so on. The intelligentsia had begun to play the role which naturally falls to it in the course of the revolutionary process. The action program of the Communist Party had anticipated the introduction of self-management and economic reform as basic demands with respect to the relations of production. The occupation of Czechoslovakia will render the struggle of Western Communist parties for a so-called democratic path to socialism much more difficult, for that country might well have served as a model of socialism for the developed countries. Although many Western Communist parties unambiguously condemn the aggression, the electoral bodies in those countries will be less inclined in their direction. But that is not the only reason. The intervention of one side can serve as an excuse for the other side to intervene militarily whenever some communist party or other wants to come to power. Before the, quote, Prague Spring, Yugoslavia had a, quote, monopoly on socialist avant-gardism in Europe, as a result of which she had allowed herself to be lulled to sleep with self-satisfaction. From January to August 1968, Czechoslovakia had opened the possibility not only of closer cooperation, but also of competition with Yugoslavia and the initiation of revolutionary change. The Stalinist military intervention was not so much the consequence of Czech desire for national liberation. There was no intervention in Romania, as it was the result of internal revolutionary changes. This was final confirmation that in the USSR, de-Stalinization was seen only as the elimination of the cult of personality, end quote, and the worst aspects of the criminal Stalinist state. In this respect, even Khrushchev was too radical, as his subsequent departure from power has shown. Under the pretense of preventing a bourgeois counter-revolution, the Stalinist oligarchy carried out a statist counter-revolutionary intervention in Czechoslovakia. On this occasion, the internal system of the USSR was manifested as well in its relations with the other countries of Eastern Europe. A small degree of relaxation and discipline within the Warsaw Bloc was not essentially disturbing the USSR's dominant position in defining the external policy and internal arrangement of the countries of the bloc. The Stalinist oligarchy does not even permit different paths to statism, much less to socialism. The extent to which expedient fallacies about the nature of Stalinism are still held is best demonstrated by the complete astonishment experienced by Marxists when Czechoslovakia was occupied. After the October Revolution, centers of revolutionary actions multiplied. So in the Stalinized communist movement, monocentrism, hegemonism, and an attempt to impose upon all a single model of, quote, socialism was developed. The dissolution of the Third International was simply a diplomatic gesture of goodwill by Stalin toward the Western Allies. Although a formal international Stalinist organization was no longer necessary to realize hegemonistic goals, a, quote, small international, quote, in the form of the Common Forum was created after the war. Ever since the dissolution of the Common Forum, international consultative meetings of communist parties have served hegemonistic goals. But along with these developments, from 1948 onward, individual countries and parties gradually began to free themselves. First, Yugoslavia, then China, along with an entire group of parties, and finally a great number of Western communist parties. After relations between the USSR and Yugoslavia had been normalized, there was a periodic renewal of Soviet pressure, for instance, upon the adoption of the 1957 program of the League of Communists of Yugoslavia. Footnote. It is all the more amazing that in the past few years, old illusions about the nature of the Soviet socio-political system have been revived. This revival is responsible for the fact that on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of the Common Forum Resolution, nothing was said to Yugoslav youth about Stalinism. After August 21st, 1968, the situation changed rapidly in this respect. End footnote. Either in 1956, an attempt at revolution in Hungary had been smothered in blood, and the revolutionary stirrings which had begun in Poland were gradually frustrated, the entire communist movement was not long to express its approval of the military intervention in Hungary, as if it had escaped everyone's notice that the events in that country had started with socialist changes, and that the elements of bourgeois counter-revolution began to acquire strength only after foreign and domestic Stalinists had frustrated the opening to the left. But even if this were not the case, how could communists approve an intervention in a country's internal affairs? Did they not thereby, although perhaps unintentionally, give a green light to future interventions? The aggression against Czechoslovakia accelerated the process of differentiation within the communist movement. If no strict line is drawn between socialism and statism, then there is no way to explain the ever-deepening rifts among communist parties. It is evident that the title, quote, communist, end quote, is claimed by extremely different, even oppositely oriented parties. Some of them have lost the right to call themselves communists in the Marxist sense. An adequate name for them would be, quote, statist parties, end quote. Severe conflicts have arisen between such parties, representing on the one hand primitive politicratic statism and on the other modern technocratic statism. Hope of socialist changes in the USSR in the long run can be based upon the following factors. Statism, having carried out rapid industrialization, has thereby created a mass industrial proletariat to serve as its own, quote, gravedigger, end quote. As we have seen, history already knows of attempts of the Eastern European working class to create its own organs of self-management. In this connection, we should also count on the boomerang effect of the Marxist self-rationalization of statism. True Marxism, with Marxism's revolutionary humanist program, the core of which is a plea for free association, of the producers, will exert strong pressure in the direction of socialist change. The Stalinist Party has not seen fit to strike self-management totally from its program, but, quote, merely, end quote, to postpone it to the communist future. But this postponement cannot go on indefinitely without irrevocably forfeiting the Marxist and communist ideological legitimacy, which the Statist Party has gone to such lengths to establish. 50 years after the revolution, the working class has still not won the right to participate in the management of the enterprise, although it has already won this right in some capitalist countries. Statism has provided the opportunity for mass education and has created an extremely large intelligentsia. It can be assumed that one part of it will help the masses to penetrate the ideological veil of statism and to shatter the information vacuum into which that system has cast them. Section 8. Marx's thesis about proletarian revolution has suffered an amazing fate. While Marx believed in the possibility of socialist revolution foremost in the highly developed capitalist countries, many of his adherents today see prospects for revolution only in the impoverished part of the world. In the past, orthodox Marxists denied the possibility of revolution prior to the full development of capitalism, and now many Marxists do not believe that revolution will come even when capitalism has reached this stage. Many draw the line dividing evolution from revolution between the developed and undeveloped parts of the world. As a consequence of the modernization of capitalism in the West, many communist parties in that part of the world have expressis verbis, abandoned all hope of revolution. In this respect, there is no difference between them and the social democratic parties. They have also oriented themselves toward coalition with other leftist parties in order to gain votes in the electoral bodies. I think this becomes the policy of Eurocommunism, although I don't think this is being called Eurocommunism at the time. Chinese ultra-leftism only appears to be preserving revolutionary Marxist tradition, since Chinese ultra-leftism implicitly proceeds from the judgment that the Western proletariats become part of the bourgeoisie. And that's absolutely true, and people still kind of believe this thing. Like people like, I would say people like, what's his name? Domenico, the people of the intellectual Stalinists of today, like Domenico Lacerda and Gabriel Rockhill, they definitely have this kind of opinion, if not attitude. They generally think the fundamental contradiction of capitalism is between, the West and the rest, or like the North versus the South. Because they're fucking stupid. Thus, Chinese politicians and theorists no longer see any real prospects for socialist revolution in the conflict between wage labor and capital. They look rather to the contradiction between the developed and undeveloped parts of the world, obviously projecting their revolutionary experience onto the rest of the world. I think also that this is also the case. I think that they view like Mao definitely had, there's definitely quotes from Mao about the prospects of nuclear war, and he's like, nuclear war will bring communism to the world, something like that. It really is that dumb. I don't think I'm putting like glib words in his mouth. Definitely viewed like, and this is how people view it now. I mean, what else can you say about people who talk about the advocacy of multipolarity in the world, like bolstering the power of countries like China and Russia in order to counterbalance the power of the United States. They've like, what's her name? I can't remember her name. Something Desai or whatever. That's like their whole thing, It's always fucking upsets me to see all this shit about like multipolarity. Like you should lend our support to like other empires other than the United States in order to create a more balanced state system, something like that. The strategic base of the Chinese Revolution was the countryside, whence the ring was gradually closed around Chiang Kai-shek's cities. By analogy with that situation, the Chinese leaders seek the vehicle of revolution in the rural masses of the undeveloped world, which they see as gradually surrounding the imperialist stronghold of the developed countries, and now they annex the USSR as well to that stronghold. Likewise, like all true dogmatists, the Chinese leaders are attempting to universalize the classic model of revolution, armed struggle. Sensing that it has no real prospects in the West, they seek to save it in the form of people's wars of liberation in the undeveloped countries, demanding that these wars encircle the developed countries, which constitute the core of class society. Obviously, the Chinese theory of revolution does not respond to the real situation and needs of the workers' movement in the West, and this is why it has not found any real response there. Except for amongst bratty teenagers who are college students and fucking cranks like Bob Avakian and others, the Progressive Labor Party and whatnot. And a lot, like I said earlier in this video, college students at my university. Anyway, the most that the Communist Party of China has achieved there is to create miniature pro-Chinese factions or parties or factions. That's absolutely right. There's a really great quote. I don't know if it's from Irving Howe or if it's from someone else, but like one of the people that were kind of like I mentioned before, there's like a social democratic and a more revolutionary wing of that emerged out of third camp. Socialism, the bureaucratic with the bureaucratic collectivist thesis on the USSR, neither Washington nor Moscow. I think it might have been Irving Howe or someone else. I think Irving Howe was associated with Dissent, some editor of Dissent who took like a more like cautious approach about endorsing these third world liberation struggles. And they were like screaming at him or something like they do now. Like like they scream at Bernie Sanders for not calling Israel's war a genocide. Fully, he's fully, is in favor of diminishing money to Israel and condemns what Israel's doing in Gaza. But the mere sheer fact that he won't call it a genocide, like it's just like they start screaming in his face. So anyway, someone was doing that to like Irving Howe or whatever, like screaming at his face, like, you know what you're gonna be? You know what you're gonna be in 5 years? A dentist. Which I thought was so fucking funny. Like you're acting as though it's like you have this like revolutionary posturing, but you're really just gonna be like just another guy in the middle class with a mortgage. Anyway. Some Marxists, among them Marcuse, interpret the contradiction between the undeveloped and developed countries in a different way. In their view, the Vietnamese Revolution and counter-revolution, for example, is a contradiction within the framework of the American capitalist system, not external to it. But this hardly seems the way to reconcile the Chinese view with the classical Marxist conception, according to which the internal class contradictions of capitalism are the basic source of socialist revolution. The Cuban Revolution is now threatened by the temptation which neither the Soviet nor Chinese revolutions were able to overcome. Of course, it is a smaller country and its pretensions are more modest. The Cuban model of the revolutionary guerrilla war must, according to Castro, Guevara, and Debré, be universally valid for Latin America, for Latin America. Many leftists, especially those who feel that other forms of revolution have a chance in that part of the world, have opposed this position, which they see as promoting Cuban ambitions, and the situation has become one of mutual accusation of pseudo-adventurism on the one hand and of opportunistic reformism on the other. There are some who assert that the Cuban case cannot be repeated because the United States will not permit itself to be caught napping again. Others respond to them that Vietnam proves that even the greatest military power in the world cannot effectively employ its entire technical potential against the people's guerrillas, nor can it crush them. At any rate, says Castro, quote, the obligation of every revolutionary is to make a revolution, end quote. Castro. It should be kept in mind that the initial impetus of the Cuban Revolution was not a socialist revolution. In fact, I believe that the Castro regime tried to have a more a good relationship with the United States, and the United States pushed them away. Only later, when Soviet support seemed like the only possibility, did they embrace a socialist, or quote socialist, perspective, calling themselves Marxist-Leninists and shit like that. And even if Guevara was involved, obviously, in the revolution, he was not that was not the initial impetus of socialism. In fact, people left. What's it? I can't remember the movement. Can't remember its name. It's like, what is it? So the July something movement. The 26th of July movement. That's what I'm thinking of. Anyway, Guevara is the heroic personification of that pledge. Guevara's entire life and his death demonstrate his indomitable conviction that a revolutionary situation may not merely be created, but that it can be forced into existence. There's a very good article on here about Klaus Barbie by, what the hell is the guy's name? Can't think of his name now. Jan Gerber. But he talks about how Klaus Barbie, who was I think it's like the Butcher of Lyon or whatever, one of the important Nazis in France when the Nazis occupied France, who escaped and later moved to Bolivia, and I think helped Bolivia with counter-revolutionary with counterinsurgency. And then he was brought back he was eventually, after years of trying and petitions by various people in France and outside France, I think certain people who were perhaps like the Mossad as well, basically were trying to get Klaus Barbie extradited. And then when he was extradited, the I can't remember the guy's fucking name, the lawyer's name. It's eluding me now, but he was like a Vietnamese French lawyer who was basically trying to say that due to the legacy of imperialism, the French state had no right to persecute or prosecute his client because of their legacy of imperialism in Vietnam and North Africa. But it was which is so fucking bizarre, because not only was he a Nazi in France, or just a Nazi in general, but he also, I'm pretty sure, was influential in helping the state of Bolivia with counterinsurgency. So he was also complicit in straight up imperialist crimes. Although I'm not really particularly sure about the exact details of Bolivia in the 1960s. Anyway, which is where Che Guevara was shot, I believe, right? I want to look that up real quick. Where did Che die? Bolivia, yeah. Where am I? Che's entire life and his death demonstrate his indomitable conviction that a revolutionary situation may not merely be created, but that it can be forced into existence. Che's revolutionary romanticism represents an extreme view of the relationship between revolutionary will and social reality. How pitiful in comparison with Guevara is the opposite point of view, which deludes itself into believing that undershooting revolutionary prospects is always better than overshooting them. Actually, only in action is it possible to discover the real possibilities inherent in any situation with complete accuracy. Castro's and Guevara's movement in Cuba was based on this principle of revolutionary activism, while the Communist Party was against their revolutionary adventurism, believing that it had recognized a priori the entire range of possibilities. The Communist Party of France recently behaved in a similar manner. In the name of realism, it tried to immortalize the revolutionary spontaneity of the students and workers! How and why did the actions of the students and workers in France, this, quote, broadening of the realm of the possible, end quote, Sartre, remain outside of the perspective of a party which has pretensions to political avant-gardism? Section 9. The French working class did not attempt to seize state power in May 1968, even less so did its organizations. An attack on the centers of state power would certainly have led to civil war in France. Only a class under the pressure of great material need would take such a risk, and then only if it were to judge the existing system to be weak. The readiness to destroy the pillars of state power depends not only upon one's attitude toward it, but also upon an evaluation of its strength. The French ruling class was in a position to use brutal force against anyone who might try to shatter its power. Even were this not the case, any such move would most likely have evoked an international bourgeois intervention. The possibility of civil war with all its human and material losses exists only on the margins of consciousness of the Western workers. The disposition to use violence was disappeared in the measure to which these countries are developed with respect to their standard of living, their level of cultural and political democracy, and mentality that goes with it. Only under special conditions would this possibility again become real. Nevertheless, it is hard to deny that in 1968 the French working class demonstrated its revolutionary spirit in another form. Millions of strikers quickly, quote, occupied all the institutions of production and culture. The working class demonstrated spontaneous and mass revolutionary spirit, while the Communist Party did everything the Communist Party could to undercut the, quote, management dimension of the general strike and attempt to turn it into a classical syndicalist strike. I don't know what it means by classical syndicalist, just a bread and butter. This case highlights the necessity of a careful examination of the relationship between spontaneity and organization in the revolutionary process. The French events proved that a small and almost completely unorganized group can fulfill the role of the revolutionary detonator, yet this fact escaped the unprepared theorists and politicians of the left, as they had become accustomed to await such initiatives from above, from the party, and they were consequently taken quite by surprise. This underestimation of revolutionary spontaneity and its potential was illustrated in yet another way. Previously, whenever mention was made of the workers' movement, it was generally the workers' organization which one had in mind. May 1968 in France struck down the assumption that in capitalism the working class is well integrated. Not long before the May events, the Communist Party of France declared itself in favor of the so-called peaceful path to socialism, and in May did everything in its power to preserve its democratic reputation. It fell into a false dilemma, thinking that the alternatives were either civil war or parliamentary struggle. The general strike, however, with its, quote, management, end quote, dimension, was neither one nor the other. Otherwise, a fierce critic of bourgeois democracy, the Communist Party of France now became the prisoner of its rules and procedures. It rightly estimated that a struggle for the introduction of the dictatorship of the proletariat would lead to catastrophic adventurism of civil war. This realism of the Communist Party, however, also had a second unrealistic side. It did not see that there were still prospects for revolution, albeit for revolution in another form. The workers' factory, quote, occupation had the goal of introducing self-management, or at least participation in self-management. It is neither an attempt to introduce the dictatorship of the proletariat nor a, quote, democratic, end quote, action in the classical sense of the word. It had certain characteristics of both, i.e. the attempt to exact acknowledgement of their right to participation or even to self-management, but in a peaceful manner. Thus, the eventual use of violence was abandoned to the ruling class. Yet this kind of negation of democracy is at the same time democratic in a more profound sense. That is to say, bourgeois democracy excludes democracy from the basic cells of everyday life. The quote management strike is democratic in the sense that the working people attempt thereby to gain control over these very groups and institutions of their everyday life. The parliamentary left is overly oriented toward the state and has not worked out a strategy of struggle for workers' participation and workers' self-management. Participation or self-management in the base would create a dualism in the capitalist system. Revolutionary changes at the higher levels of government would have greater prospects after the introduction and broadening of this dualism. In Sartre's editorial, Le Temps Moderne, referred to above, it was justly asserted that the outcome of the French events would have most probably been different had a strong revolutionary party existed. Such a party would have reinforced and organized the strikers to elect organs of self-management and to return to work in the, quote, occupied factories and, quote, and institutions under their leadership. If it may be presumed that the left will win at the polls at some future date, it is hard to see how it could take charge of power and retain it without relying upon participation or self-management in the base. The French events have proved that there is no sharp boundary between the workers' syndicalist and political pretensions, since the general strike had at once both a classical syndicalist and political, quote, management character. What we have yet to discover is what can inspire people to take revolutionary action in the most highly developed capitalist countries. It is generally recognized that there is a close correlation between the readiness of the people for revolution and the conditions in which they live. The Western working class does not live in material poverty, and thus does not feel that revolution is a pressing need, nor is it disposed to risk what it already has for the sake of revolution. One need not accept the exaggerations of the theories of the, quote, affluent society and the, quote, consumer society in order to see that the proletariat in the West is no longer a class which has nothing to lose but its chains. Many communist parties used to see material impoverishment as a necessary condition for socialist revolution. They thought that unless the proletariat is pauperized, all hope in its revolutionary potential must be abandoned. Sorry, I'm paranoid that I've stopped recording. Thus they had altogether too long, attempted to preserve at all costs the old, by now mythological vision of an impoverished proletariat in the West. In order to retain this picture, communist theorists had to introduce new concepts, one of which is the notion of a, quote, workers' aristocracy, end quote. But something could be achieved by use of this concept only in Lenin's day and for a while after that. Today, a great part of the Western working class, in certain countries, the majority of the working class is, quote, aristocratized, end quote. The existence of political democracy in the West reinforces man's general desire to participate in the management of institutions and groups in which he lives and works daily. This demand, of course, has neither the force nor the spontaneity with which the desire for the procurement of one's material existence is expressed. In a case in which the material situation does not motivate people to revolution, it is the consciousness of their entire social situation which becomes the primary factor. After all, individual Marxists have long been insisting that the working class was for Marx the quintessence of total poverty, and not only material poverty, and that the key to understanding changes in its revolutionary motivation must be sought in this idea. The growth of the intelligentsia and the intelligentsia's theoretical and ideological work in the Western revolutionary movement must also be seen in this light. Footnote: the examples of Poland and Hungary in 1956 and now Czechoslovakia prove that the same holds true for the intelligentsia in Eastern Europe. End footnote. The worker spontaneously expresses his revolutionary spirit in conditions of material poverty, but understanding of the total social situation and of human perspectives must mediate between human poverty, as distinguished from material poverty, and the revolutionary spirit. Thus the role of the intelligentsia as the primary necessary ally of the proletariat is all the more significant. It is evident from this how short-sighted the thesis of the end of both revolutionary and other ideology has been. Yet although the revolt of the intelligentsia itself is not without revolutionary significance, The intelligentsia is not the basic revolutionary subject of the modern world. One might more aptly speak of a broadening of the classical revolutionary subject. After all, a great deal of the intelligentsia is also composed of wage laborers. Disenchanted in the working class which they had formerly fetishized, some theorists now fetishize the revolutionary potential of the intelligentsia. While the French event showed that part of the intelligentsia, especially intellectual youth, can act as the revolutionary detonator, they also confirmed that no one can take the place of the working class in its revolutionary role. The socialist transformation of the class mode of production is not feasible without the participation of the proletariat as the primary producing class. Footnote. Marcuse, under the influence of the events in France, returned to the classical Marxist evaluation of the revolutionary potential of the working class in his paper given at Corcula in 1968. Corcula was like a socialist summer school that was organized by the Praxis Group. Previously, Marcuse had been overly impressed by the American situation and on this basis had reached the general conclusion that the Western working class was integrated into the capitalist system, although he did not draw any reformist conclusions from this. He placed his revolutionary hopes in the quote, outsiders to the capitalist system, national and racial minorities, the permanently and hopelessly impoverished, and the students and youth in general. Footnote. The reference to Corcula concerns the annual conference held there in August, sponsored by the editorial board of Praxis. So you know what I'm talking about. And footnote. Quote, the new working class, and quote, the class of the future as a consequence of the penetration of automation is composed of technicians, supervisors, engineers, and researchers, however, and not only of the classical manual producers. Thus the sharp boundary between the working class and a good part of the intelligentsia is being destroyed. If, quote, the new working class, unquote, is an increasingly significant and powerful part of the working class, then profound changes in the way in which that class expresses its revolutionary nature should not surprise us in the least. The French workers did not occupy the factories only in order to negotiate questions of distribution. They are interested in questions of management as well. Redistribution of power and not only redistribution of wealth entered into their demands. De Gaulle himself admitted that the question was not exclusively one of the level of wages, the length of the working day, and improvement of the conditions of labor, but that it was also one of the desires of the workers for self-determination. De Gaulle understood that capitalism can save itself only through concessions, through worker participation in the management of the enterprise. Why was the left so reluctant to accept these concessions and then later raise new and greater demands? Participation could hurt the workers' movement only if it were to exalt that it had thereby achieved its goal. The struggle of the working class for participation in capitalism will have in turn a great impact upon the outcome of the epochal dilemma, statism or socialism in these countries. Whether or not the workers' political organizations will alienate themselves from the workers or simply be executors of the workers' will depends largely upon the workers' position in the management of the enterprise at the moment when their organizations take power. In almost all revolutionary movements in capitalism, the workers' aspiration to self-management has been expressed. Nor was 1968 the first time that the French workers had, quote, seized the factories. But the most recent wave of, quote, seizures, unquote, has struck down the thesis that workers are interested in self-management only when they live in material poverty, and the view that the capitalist system of production is socially the most efficient was once again shattered. It would be difficult indeed to call a system, quote, efficient, that had provoked the revolt of so many millions of workers. In order to understand the events in France from a theoretical standpoint, we need not change Marx's definition of, quote, revolution, but only Marx's vision of the course of socialist revolution. Revolution must be seen as a process of radical transformation of a socioeconomic totality, and above all, of its mode of production, which most powerfully defines the nature of the whole. In this respect, it is no longer important in which order or by which means this process unfolds. Marx expected the political revolution would be the first step from which other radical changes would follow. The course of socialist revolutions in the past has confirmed the belief held by Marxists in this order of events. Since in France there was no chance for the people to take over state power, the old left saw no prospects for any radical changes whatsoever. All indications are that in the West, political revolution will be merely the finale to a prolonged process of social revolution. In this sense, the socialist revolution will bear a greater resemblance to bourgeois democratic revolutions than to the socialist revolutions of the past. We must also note that previous revolutions have been connected with violence, But in the future, neither will the term, quote, violent revolution, end quote, be redundant, nor will, quote, peaceful revolution, end quote, be a contradiction in terms. As distinct from the majority of the old left, the new left in the West does not limit its political arsenal to bourgeois democratic means. This is why Marcuse, of all the contemporary Marxists, suits it so well. Che Guevara is the idol of the young rather than some leftist who is competing for power or who has already achieved power. This in itself demonstrates the attitude with which the new left regards the old left. Of course, the old left retaliates, attacking the new left for anarchism, extremism, adventurism, revolutionary impatience, and the like. Insofar as they have replaced impatience with indifference, many old leftists, among them many communists, find themselves speaking the same language as the, quote, bourgeois opposition, and, quote, more often than the language of the new generation of leftists. Nevertheless, when we talk about the new left, we must take care of the new version of the old left. Must take care as a new version of the old left, Trotskyism, Maoism, and so forth, is also called the new left. And this is important. If you look at the work of like Timothy S. Brown and other people, like I think you can really definitely say that there was like two new lefts, right? Like the new left, though, is influenced by things like situationism or like the Frankfurt School, for instance, right? It was not the same new left that was influenced by Mao and Che, right? There's a couple of pieces on this channel that I think, if you're interested in this topic, we were checking out, is Lauren Goldner's review of Max Elbaum's book, Revolution in the Air, which is a critique of like the authoritarian turn on the part of the student movement and Elbaum's celebration of it, or his like his cheap characterization of anything that that wasn't third worldism as like Eurocentric Marxism or something like that. He's definitely a very rich critique of this conception of that book. The other thing that's super interesting is Christoph Rangeli, the editor of Dataside magazine, has a review of a German book by a guy named Jens Benecke. It's called like From Adorno to Mao, which is about like the transition from the Frankfurt School influenced anti-authoritarian movement of the German SDS, which is like initially like a group that which is like initially the youth wing of the SPD, which was expelled from the SPD. And it's the generation from like being Frankfurt School influence to being more influenced by the traditions of Lenin, Stalin, Mao. Definitely Maoism was like the big thing that a lot of activists in Germany had transitioned to. And you could say that as well of like a lot of people, like just kind of the global over, like it's not, it doesn't have the appeal that it once had, even though I think its appeal is kind of strong. Because it's they misunderstand the content of it, or they're just authoritarians. There's definitely like there's a couple pieces on this channel anyway that are about this kind of like split. I'm not sure if I have anything. There is a really good piece called "Listen Marxist," which I'm not sure is on this channel, but by Marie Bookchin, which is a critique of like the influence of Maoism and the Progressive Labor Party in the Students for a Democratic Society, and his critique of that. It's hard. I would say though that even though Maoism I think is like kind of like is and I've said this before and other things, but I think it's kind of a weird thing because it's like kind of like an ultra voluntarist form of Stalinism is how, if I was to like encapsulate what Maoism is, it's like a very populist, anti-intellectual, power of the will kind of politics, which is very exciting to like a young person, or to like young people, I think especially. You don't have to read. We just need to do. We don't need to study. We don't need to think. We need to just do shit. But but it's kind of in a weird. It's very much like a weird spot, and I think like I'd like to do more. Personally, I'd like to do more research into the history of it. I meant to finish Simone Leigh's book called the Chairman's New Clothes, which is kind of like pulls the pants down on on the ideas that the New Left and the intelligentsia of France, in particular, in the late 1960s, had about the nature of the so-called Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, and the fact that it was kind of like a top-down initiated civil war in order to put Mao and his clique back into the saddle after they've been kind of like kicked upstairs after the extremely suicidal policies that led to the Great Leap Forward, which somewhere between 15 and 40 million people died, depending on who you ask. I think the official communists, I think China officially acknowledges that there was at least 20 million deaths, but I think it was much more. Anyway, and I also wasn't successful. Like the sacrifice didn't even culminate in anything. I think the Great Leap Forward was like an abysmal failure in terms of like the industrialization goals, and the growth of China industrially did not really, I don't think, really took off until it embraced the market under Deng Xiaoping in the late 1970s. Anyway, nevertheless, when we talk about the New Left, we must take care as a new version of the Old Left. Trotskyism, Maoism, and so forth is also called the New Left. Trotskyism, I wouldn't call part of the New Left. Obviously, it was operative in the New Left, but then you could say, but definitely was operative in the New Left in all countries that it had a presence. You know, Britain especially, France as well. It is particularly important to determine why Maoism today appeals to some young people in the West. It seems that Maoism appeals to young people, for one thing, because of Maoism's asceticism, as well as because of Maoism's struggle to instill moral values in Maoism's adherents, and finally because the participation which Maoism demands of the broad masses. But asceticism can seem appealing only if one views asceticism from the safe distance of, quote, consumer society, end quote. Some young leftists overlook the fact that the Maoist system of moral values excludes as a mere, quote, trifle, freedom of personality, and that the great, quote, spontaneous, end quote, mass movements in China have obscured the manipulators of these very movements. And that's precisely the dynamic that Simone Leigh was trying to demonstrate. His book was also put up by Champ Libre. I'm not sure I actually say it, but it's a book that was by a publisher that De Boer was involved with for a long time, that put out like the collective works of like Bakunin and the collective works of George Orwell, amongst others. Society of the Spectacle. I think it put out Bruno Rizzi's Bureaucratization of the World, and other important pieces from the left. Anyway, amongst other texts, I think it put out like fiction and shit as well. The New Left is a welcome phenomenon because the New Left will reinforce the differentiation of the entire left wing of the contemporary political scene. In an analogy to the former split between communists and social democrats, now a new differentiation between the revolutionary and the opportunistic left has come into sight, even within existing left parties. A great portion of the old left has become harmless to capitalism, and in statism has been transformed to the ruling and conservative right. The left-oriented younger generation must penetrate the leftist parties and try to revolutionize them. This, in my opinion, is a more hopeful path than simply to create completely new organizations. Unfortunately, the New Left has an aversion to any durable form of organization, though it has shown an extraordinary sense of quick and spontaneous organization. While the organization of the Old Left suffers from petrification, the New Left is threatened by the danger of fetishizing revolutionary spontaneity. Socialism is one of the great humanist conceptions which, in the process of their realization, suffer heavy setbacks, but which nevertheless persistently come back to life. The current generation of leftists does not suffer from the illusions about Stalinism, which was characteristic of the pre-war left and of its pupils. That's not true. For one, Trotskyists were thinking, we're still, except for a very small minority, we're still considering the USSR a degenerated worker state. And that, like, except for, like, the state capitalist in the UK under Tony Cliff, and then, like, the remains of, like, the independent socialists under the leadership of, like, Max Shachtman, and, like, New Politics, which, you know, whether you want to call New you could argue about whether, you know, it's best to call it third camp Trotskyism or third camp socialism, but definitely, like, maybe, like, left Shachtmanism in the United States, which didn't really constitute a party, but did have, like, it did have, like, some political influence on certain sections of the student movement, such as Lauren Goldner, for instance. But the Trotskyists definitely thought that Stalinism, obviously they're very critical of Stalinism, but fundamentally thought the society, Stalinist society, was a workers' society. The economic base, nationalized property, was sufficient for the Stalinism to be a worker state. And if they didn't think that it was a worker state, some of the people, like, in the Trotskyist camp, kind of dropped that appellation to some extent, depending on who you're talking about. But they viewed it as, like, a transitional society, an entire epoch, kind of like bureaucratic, the non-third camp bureaucratic collectivists, like Rizzi or, like, Burnham after he had abandoned socialism and Marxism, right? That this was, like, the wave that a whole new society, a whole new statist society was the necessary sequel to capitalism, and that opponents to capitalism should critically support the Soviet Union against, you know, the rest of the world, and so on and so forth. And then with Maoism, and it can't be emphasized this enough, it's like Maoism is a form of Stalinism. That's how they, and that's not, like, just a you know, being like, oh, like, not that you need Stalin to criticize Mao, even if you could say Mao wasn't a Stalin, it's just from, like, what he did in the world and his contribution to human civilization. It was a fucking fiasco, a deadly fiasco, caused millions of deaths, and an extreme repression, and extreme, like, ideological warfare that was, like, fundamentally empty of emancipatory content, right? But you don't need to say that Maoism was a form of Stalinism to say that Maoism was a fiasco. The Maoism was, in fact, a form of Stalinism. And in fact, if you look at this new left that's emerging, especially, you know, I think this was written in, like, 67 or something. No, not 67. It was, like, 69, I think it was originally published. It was when the authoritarianization of the student movement was thickening. There was more and more of an appeal to, like, especially, for instance, in West Germany, to the classics. They said Mao, Stalin, Lenin, Marx, or Marx, Lenin, Stalin, Mao, however you want to put the order. But that was, like, their trajectory, right? There wasn't, like, oh, Marx, Lenin, Mao. It was Marx, Lenin, Stalin, Mao. And it was a form of Stalinism, which, again, was a form of, like, kind of, like, ultra-voluntarist populism, with kind of, like, its emancipatory credentials were extremely, extremely hollow. And really achieved nothing, just a lot of death. Like the so-called the Great Leap Forward caused millions of deaths. I don't think, and then the great so-called Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution caused, I think, I'm not sure exact numbers. Maybe I'm making this up, so don't quote me on this. I'm already talking mass, but like 2 million, and a lot of them were the Chinese state trying to put down the revolution, that the fucking civil, like, the vacuous civil war that Mao had started in the country. When the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, was had to quell this revolution. Anyway, the current generation of leftists does not suffer from the illusions about Stalinism, which is characteristic of the pre-war left and its pupils. In its most recent actions, the Stalinist oligarchy has done everything in its power to reinforce the immunity of youth to its, quote, socialist mythology. As a side note, Maoism as a movement, it fundamentally, obviously people who were coming to it from the student movement wouldn't have been part of this development, but at least like the Progressive Labor Party and other Stalinist parties emerge from the sections of the communist parties, the Western and global communist parties, that disagreed, that thought that were so horrified, not by the content, not by like Stalinism, but by Khrushchev's 20th speech, that they and the general communist movements going on board with de-Stalinization and the thaw, they rejected that. They rejected de-Stalinization. That was like a big part of like why they became like separate organizations, especially. And the other part of it was that they were trying to make a peace with the Western powers. And by peace means that they weren't going to try to initiate wars, any hot wars with the United States and the West, especially when the nuclear option was there. And obviously it came to the brink, right, in like the Cuban Missile Crisis and so on and so forth, where like the possibility of some kind of nuclear action was really, really on the table. Whereas Mao was fully believed in like creating in warfare between China and the United States, for instance, right? And didn't think that thought in some sense that a nuclear holocaust would have had like a progressive consequence at the end of it. After all, imperialism's only a paper tiger, not an entire system that's armed to the fucking teeth. That would not go down easily. You might be able to kick it out of some countries, but you might be able to kick the United States out of, say, Vietnam. You might have to, they might have to make a break for it in, 1975 or something like that. But you're not going to conquer the United States or something like that in an easy way, or you might like. It's going to be, and in the case of Vietnam, that demonstrated itself fully, right? The brutality of that conflict, what it is just like a flicker compared to what would have happened if there would have been some kind of actual world war between, say, China and the United States. So Maoism kind of emerges from, Maoism is in a certain sense, you could say that Khrushchev and the communist parties were no longer, where they might have had the economic basis and the social, the structure of the society were Stalinist and were the residue of the Stalinist period, but were in some sense trying to get away from that, at least the excesses of Stalinism, whereas the Maoist wing rejected that there was any excesses. I have a piece on here that's about, I can't remember what it's not, I think it's by a guy named Henry Park. It's about theses about state capitalism in the USSR, mostly coming from the Maoist camp, and that guy Henry Park himself was a Maoist. And it's very much like there's chapters and there's Stalin was really holding on to the socialist character of the Soviet Union, which is now being undone by the capitalist voters at the top. So you could say that there was the Maoist critiques of the Soviet Union were Stalinist critiques of the Soviet Union. So a lot of these words I think we should really be cautious about. calling Brezhnev's USSR Stalinist is apt on one level, but on another level, it doesn't fully account for the relatively serious changes, obviously not very deep changes, but significant change, I guess, significant changes that were happening at the top of the Soviet bureaucracy at this time, which was definitely more cautious. I think the cautiousness of the Western Communist parties to the New Left reflects this cautiousness. Whereas I would not characterize Stalinism as a cautious process. I'd accuse it of being like very voluntarist, extremely. Stalinism got shit done. Not good shit, but it changed. It radically overhauled society in a way that cost a lot of lives. It was whereas there's something different, definitely about the Khrushchev and Brezhnev eras that was way more cautious, and in ways that were beneficial and or I don't know. I've been reading too long. I've been reading for like 2 hours straight now. Maybe it's upward to 3 hours, and I haven't checked it in a while. Basically, there's an aptness to call, like, because it doesn't really like. I think that the Chinese side of the Sino-Soviet split, at least I guess like outside of the Soviet Union, I guess those were the true inheritors of Stalinism. They were upholding Stalinism, whereas they felt that the Khrushchev, Brezhnev, the Western Communist parties were, they were now revisionist parties, right? And de-Stalinization and the Khrushchev secret speech were a big part of that, like revisionism. So to say that like the new left was not Stalinist is problematic in my view. In its most recent actions, the Stalinist oligarchy has done everything in its power to reinforce the immunity of youth to its, quote, socialist mythology. Unfortunately, the new left is not prepared to identify socialism with the reality of any single country, considering it a, quote, shining beacon, end quote, to the rest of the world. A lot of them did. Whether that be China or Albania or whatever, they did. Or Cuba for that matter. The appeal of Cuba was huge among the new left. Although a great part of the old left in the form of Stalinism and literally social democratic opportunism has more than once drowned the ideals of socialism, these ideals still shine from the depths and magnetically attract a new generation of adherents, both in capitalism and in statism. Okay, so I'm finally finished reading that chapter now, The Statist Myth of Socialism, which was what? Was that chapter 3? I don't even remember. Yeah, that was chapter 3 of of Svetozar Stojanović, Between Ideals and Reality, A Critique of Socialism and Its Future. Thank you so much for listening. I thank you for listening to such a long video, and also listening to me give my opinions. I really appreciate it. Bye-bye.